Board of Regents, which began yesterday at 4 p.m. And we will move right now into the first agenda item, which is approval of the minutes from the March 6th and 7th meeting. Is there a motion?
So moved.
There has been a motion by Regent Robinson. Is there any board discussion? Any board discussion? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, nay.
Aye.
The ayes have it. April 7th, 2014 conference call minutes.
So moved.
There is a motion to approve the conference call minutes by Regent Robinson. Any discussion by the board? Any discussion by the board? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes have it. Thank you very much. There is much to celebrate this spring in the Montana University system, as there always is this time of year. We are fortunate to celebrate this month the graduation of more than 8,000 students from the various units of the MUS. As we honor the success of these graduates, our customers, we know that nearly 80% of them will stay right here in Montana, helping to fuel the economic growth and vitality of our state. And just as we celebrated the largest single private gift in state history to Montana State University at our last meeting, we now celebrate the largest research investment the University of Montana has ever received, $45 million from the Army Corps of Engineers. All of this, on both sides of the university system, is further evidence of our strength and that we're headed in the right direction. During our time together over the next 2 days, we will learn much about special initiatives and ongoing efforts to better serve our student body and our state. Importantly, we will discuss new opportunities to tackle the very serious issues of alcohol abuse and sexual assault on all of our campuses, regardless of their size and where they're located. The safety of our students will continue to be a #1 priority of this board and our system. We also will hear about the system's efforts to enroll and graduate our state's American Indian population. Assuring success for Montana's first residents strengthens our commitment to inclusiveness, but also makes our state stronger economically, particularly in our rural areas and in our reservation communities. The report concerning affordability indicators will show that the Montana University system continues to be a bargain for students when compared to our regional competitors. This is due in large measure to the effective partnerships we have forged with the executive and legislative branches and a real long-term commitment to tuition restraint from this board. We must be aware, however, of the increasing student debt, loan debt our graduates are saddled with as they transition into the workforce. For this reason, we will also be discussing a new financial literacy product designed to teach fiscal responsibility to students looking to finance their education in appropriate, affordable ways. It is truly a pleasure to welcome 2 new members of the board who I know will serve with distinction. Bill Johnstone and Martha Sheehy are great Montanans who both support a quality system of higher education for our residents. Welcome to both of you. Finally, I want to celebrate Regent Regala's service to our state and to Montana's student body, for which he is such a strong advocate. Zach, thank you for your tenure as a member of this board, and we perhaps are going to be talking a little bit more about your service to this board this evening, but thank you for your service. I now want to turn the floor and the mic over to Chancellor Limbaugh to formally welcome us to MSU Northern. Chancellor Limbaugh.
Thank you, Chair Tuss. On behalf of all of us here at Montana State University Northern, those of you who are returning, welcome back. And those of you who are brand new to Havre and the Highline, welcome. You're here at a particularly beautiful time of the year, so we're very glad to host you. You know, I've always been a student of history, and history informs who we are. And for those of you who don't know anything about Northern, there's a couple of things I want you to be aware of. The first classes at MSU Northern, then Northern Montana College, were on September 30th, 1929. A month later, Black Tuesday hit. And so this institution began in the midst of the Great Depression. The building, for example, that you'll see when you walk up to the dinner this evening, Pershing Hall was built from bricks from the old Fort Assiniboine, and students at that time got wagons and horses and hauled 100,000 bricks or more from Fort Assiniboine, which is 7 miles away, here to a building that was designed by a local community man who wanted the university to succeed. In fact, there were no state dollars put into this institution for buildings until well after World War II. So this institution is built on a history of resilience, a history of community support, and a history of wanting to be sure that students in the Highline had the opportunity to continue their education. And for the last 2 years, I have been privileged to work at an institution that continues to build on that resilience and that level of community engagement. So since the last time you all were here, I'd like to tell you what we've accomplished. We've completely renovated our gymnasium. It's now a jewel box of a gymnasium. For those of you in Frontier Conference that came here and played, and many times we beat you, I will not be ashamed in saying that. We're very proud of that. You'll be having lunch today in our food court, which was the result of a community collaboration, volunteer work that gave the students a place to lounge and a place to eat. We've completely upgraded this building. In fact, when you were here last time, the fireside room was an open lounge with old sofas, and it's now a state-of-the-art conference room. And if you notice on the plaque, that happened because of community partnership. We will be showing off our new museum of the Northern Montana Plains Indian tonight at dinner. We've been implementing campus-wide beautification. I've never known how much I love sidewalks until I had to start replacing them. So that's been very important to us. We're now in the priorities or the implementation phase of our academic program prioritization as we work to develop a niche market here. All 5 of our major NAIA sports were nationally ranked last year, and we are the only school in the Frontier Conference to have achieved that particular recognition. Our wrestling team took 3rd at national. Our volleyball team is Frontier Conference champions, and both our men's and women's basketball team made appearances at national tournament, and that's a significant achievement for a little school of 1,400 students 40 miles from the Canadian border. We are hiring some wonderful new faculty to support our niche market, and I've been so pleased to bring to the campus outstanding leadership in all our major areas, academic affairs, financial affairs, student affairs, information technology, that we're all working together to develop a campus up here of significance that builds on its history. So we are very proud of this. I'm privileged to serve as the chancellor of an institution with such a wonderful history, and I'm so glad that you all are going to be here to see what Havre is, see what Northern is, and celebrate with me the contributions it has made and will continue to make to the system. So again, welcome to everybody. Now, a couple of housekeeping things. First, backed by popular demand, because I've heard about it for 2 years, yes, we have trail mix at the break. Our students are very committed to recycling here, so you notice there's no water bottles. We have Culligan containers in the back and over outside by the break room. We are using special cornstarch cups and recyclable cups. I'm sharing the commitment with my students. We want to put as little as possible into the environment. So thank you for agreeing to do that with us. The restrooms, we have a wheelchair accessible restroom right here near the fireside room, and the ubiquitous locations, like last time, they're upstairs or downstairs as you go out that way, so that's where the restrooms are. Today at lunch, you're going to be treated as a Northern student. Our food court is going to be completely open and functioning. You just come in and order whatever you want, whether it's Mexican, sandwiches, grill items, a salad. You order it, and then we'll bring it out to the table for you, so you'll have the opportunity to experience what our students experience. We'll also have soft drinks available throughout at the food court for those of you who need a caffeine hit quicker than we can get it to you. On Thursday's dinner, the dinner is going to be in our library, so from here you'll just go up the Hello Walk. And the Hello Walk is so named because the last 40 years, every homecoming, our students repaint it with symbols of their clubs and that kind of thing. So it's a little worn right now, but it'll be repainted again this fall. And finally, this building is not air conditioned. It was built in 1961, and have opened the doors all night to let cool air in. We're hoping that the sun gain and that what we have, our cool spring days up here continue, although I have heard about it being 82 degrees. So this may be a hint, Chair Tuss, to move it along, because otherwise we'll all get quite warm. So with that, we have gentlemen here in the maroon shirts. If you have any issues with your connections, we'll be glad to help you out. So please stop and ask any of us if you have any questions, because we want you to enjoy being here as much as we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chancellor Limbaugh. I see that I did skip over introductions, and so I would like to turn the mic over to the CEOs with regard to any introductions of new folks on their campuses that they have. President Cruzado?
Yes, Mr. Chair, members of the board, good morning. It's a beautiful day. We are very happy with our campuses at Montana State University, and today I'm honored to make several introductions. I would like to make an introduction for the MSU campus, two for the MSU Billings campus, and then I would like to ask the Billings campus and our wonderful people from Great Falls also to make one introduction each. On the MSU Bozeman campus, I'm delighted to inform that we have conducted a search for a new Chief Information Officer, and we have identified Mr. Jerry Sheehan as our new CIO. Mr. Sheehan has over a decade of senior management experience leading information technology organizations in some of the nation's premier public universities. Prior to coming to MSU, Jerry was the Chief of Staff for the California Institute for Telecommunications and Information Technology, also known as CALIT-2. CALIT-2 is one of the largest information technology research organizations in the United States, with over 900 faculty members and participants at UC San Diego and UC Irvine, 170 technical staff, and over 200 corporate partners. The Institute is an ecosystem of innovation that applies leading-edge academic IT research to the problems of the citizens of California. His additional executive management experiences include acting as the Chief Operating Officer and as the Associate Vice President for Strategic Planning for the Central Information Technology Organization at Purdue University, a unit with a $50 million budget and 400 staff. And finally, as an Assistant Deputy Director at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the University of Illinois. And since May the 1st, we at MSU are very fortunate to have Jerry Sheehan serving as our CIO. Jerry? Next, moving to the MSU Billings campus, a person that doesn't need an introduction. But we are so absolutely honored, so delighted when Commissioner Emerita Sheila Stearns accepted my frantic call for her to serve as the interim chancellor of MSU Billings. As you know very well, Sheila has a stellar career in academic administration that has touched so many of our campuses. It has touched the U of M campus. It has touched the U of M Western campus, where she served as chancellor. Then she left us for other opportunities and came back to Montana and had a wonderful career as a commissioner of higher education. I have a special debt of gratitude to Commissioner Sheila Stearns because she was the commissioner that brought me to Montana. So therefore, I felt in absolute confidence when I reached out to her, and I told her that I could not think of a better person that could provide the sense of stability, prepare the field, till the soil, and plant the new seed, so that when the new chancellor came to MSU Billings, everything was going to be in order and speak and span as only Sheila Stearns know how to do everything with absolute excellence. Thank you, Commissioner Emerita, for being with us.
President Cruzado, I will note for the fiscal hawks in the room that we didn't have to have the expense of a new nameplate for Sheila Stearns. It was in the basement, so we grabbed it for her.
And also, it is absolutely a pleasure to tell the Regents that we have successfully concluded our search for our next Chancellor of the MSU Billings. And what an honor to introduce Dr. Mark Nook. Prior to accepting our invitation just last Tuesday, let the record show that I made that offer less than 10 days ago. And he's here, he and his wife are with us here today. Dr. Mark Nook served as Senior Vice President for Academic and Student Affairs at the University of Wisconsin System Administration. You know about the size of that system. Suffice it to say that it has 181,000 students. And in his role, Mark worked directly with 14 chancellors, 15 provosts, and 15 student affairs offices on issues related to academic and student affairs policy development, implementation, and assessment. He oversaw the Office of Academic, Faculty, and Global Programs, Inclusivity, Diversity, and Student Services, and Policy Analysis and Research. Prior to his previous position, he served as provost for 3 years and interim chancellor for 1 year at UW-Stevens Point. During Mark's tenure at UWSP, international engagement was enhanced, the revision of the university's general degree requirements was initiated, and the Wisconsin Institute for Sustainable Technologies was developed and launched. Prior to living in Wisconsin, Mark worked at St. Cloud State University, SCSU, in Minnesota, becoming a full professor, department chair, and dean of undergraduate studies. As the dean, Mark was responsible for developing SCSU's first-year experience program and providing leadership to the academic support services on campus. Mark also played a leadership role on issues of diversity and inclusivity at SCSU in serving as the chair of the committees that wrote the university's diversity curriculum and racial issues curriculum. He received his BA in physics and mathematics from Southwest Minnesota State University, a master's degree in astrophysics from Iowa State University, and a PhD in astronomy from UW-Madison. In addition to doing all these wonderful jobs remarkably well, he and his wife Cheryl, who is also joining us today, enjoy outdoor activities and attending university cultural and athletics events, so you can see that this was exactly the right person that we were looking for. Cheryl and Mark have 3 adult children and 1 5-month-old granddaughter, and they are right here with us wearing the right colors for MSU Billings. So, Mark and Cheryl.
Welcome, Dr. Nook.
And with that, and go Yellow Jackets, I'm going to defer to Commissioner Stearns, who has an announcement to make.
Thank you, Madam President and Mr. Christian and Chairman. I will defer to Provost Pagano for an introduction for MSU Billings, a senior position. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Stearns. I'll let Chancellor Nook know that we're working on his behalf before he even gets there. And after a national search, we were very pleased to hire a dean for our largest college in MSU, the College of Arts and Sciences, right here under our own nose. One of those excellent colleagues that Jen Limbaugh was talking about from the Northern campus, Dr. Christine Shear-Permine, the current dean at Northern, is going to come to MSU Billings on July 7th. We're very thrilled to have her. She has a long career here at Northern and also at, she's here? Yes. She's already been nicknamed on our campus Dean Christine.
Thank you, Mark. And finally, I would like to defer to Dean Susan Wolf, who also has an announcement to make.
And I would like to ask Dr. Heidi Pasek to come up and make an introduction, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Wolf, President Cruzado, Chair Tuss, members of the board. I am pleased to announce that Dr. Bruce Gottwig is our new director of the Division of Business, Trades, and Technology at Great Falls College, MSU. Dr. Gottwig has served as the program director and lead faculty for our Computer Information Technology Microcomputer Support Program for well over 15 years. We are pleased to welcome him in his new role as a member of our division directors team. Dr. Gottwig. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, President Cruzado. President Engstrom, are there any introductions on your side of the House?
Mr. Chairman, we do not have administrative people to introduce today from the Missoula campus, and I don't believe from any of the affiliate campuses at this point. However, is that correct, Don and Dan? And, yeah, okay. I would, however, like to make an introduction, or I'm not sure what you call it, but an acknowledgement of Chancellor Story, who is retiring. This will be his final board meeting, and we will recognize him, of course, tomorrow or this evening at the reception. But I wanted to just take this opportunity in the public meeting, Dick, to say how much we appreciate the service that you have given the university system and UM Western these past 10 years, and we're very much going to miss having you in our system, and we'll talk more this evening, but thank you for the service that you have given the system. Would you join me in thanking you? Mr. Chair, we do have a search underway for that position, and we anticipate finishing that search sometime in the fall semester. Would you like us to introduce student leadership at this time?
Sure, that would
Is
be
that
appropriate.
okay? Okay, I would love to introduce to you the newly elected student senators, ASUM leadership from the University of Montana, one of whom you are very familiar with, Asa Holman, in a rare coup has been re-elected as ASUM president, so congratulations, Asa. And his vice president is Sean McKillen, who is here with us today as well. So thank you both. We also have newly elected leadership for the Faculty Senate. Steve Lodmill is here as the new chair of Faculty Senate, and Bill Borey as the vice chair of Faculty Senate. So congratulations and welcome to both of you. Thank you.
Thank you, President Engstrom. At this point, I'd also like to introduce Mariah Williams. Mariah is in the audience. Mariah will be serving as our new student regent. Mariah is a student at the University of Montana, and her appointment to this board was recently announced by Governor Steve Bullock, and her term begins, I believe, on July 1st. Congratulations. Commissioner.
Mr. Chairman, we have one introduction for new staff in your office, in the Commissioner's office, after an international search, since she came from a stint in Europe. I'd like to announce Elizabeth Baker, who joins us, actually a Helena native, Carroll College graduate, is the new admin position for the Deputy Commissioners, is the new Amy, as we say, in the Commissioner's office. So Elizabeth, welcome.
That takes us to your report, Commissioner.
All right. Well, we are ready to do that. First thing up, we're going to go over an enrollment report. And we have, as we like to say, T squared, Mr. Tyler Trevor to present.
There we go. Nothing like starting off the meeting with data, and what better to talk about than enrollment. What I have for you to hear today is a very brief presentation, and I'll move fairly quick, so interrupt me at any time with a question. I would be glad to slow down at any point and address specific topics. every May meeting, we bring to you the fiscal year enrollment report. That is the official enrollment for the university system. It's the annualized student FTE. And what that means for people that need the actual formula, we take summer FTE and we add it to fall. And then we add it to spring. And we divide by 2, not 3. So, and an FTE, just so we're clear on that, is an undergraduate student enrolled in 15 credits. That can be 1 student enrolled in 15 credits or 5 students enrolled in 3 credits, whatever combination you want to get to no, it's 12 credits for a graduate student and 15 credits for an undergraduate student. So with that out of the way, you can take a look at the 10-year history, and I always like to couch our official enrollment with a 10-year view. It's really the way to go in terms of looking at trends. And pretty much most of the time I've been employed here, I've stood up here and said, we have record enrollment. And that was really fun. But for the last 2 years, I haven't said that. And we've dropped about 700 FTE 2 consecutive years now in a row. We're slightly under 40,000 FTE for the total in the system. That's still a 3,700 FTE growth over a 10-year period of time, a 10% growth. But it is a change in terms of this report and kind of the tenor of it. So let's just compare last year to this year. What's going on? We have an overall about a 2% decline, 700 FTE, as I said. All of that decline basically resides in your undergraduate area and specifically resident undergraduate students. We dropped 1,000 FTE in resident undergraduate students. We increased about 400 FTE in non-residents. So again, let's back up and look at what's occurred over a 10-year period of time, 2004 to 2014. In that period of time, most of the growth, 80% of it, has occurred with non-resident students. We've grown a total of about 650 resident students and somewhere a little bit above 3,000 non-resident students. And the categories over there of resident undergraduate, resident graduate, those relate, they're there because it's sort of, that's how we report enrollment. It relates back to our broad categories that translate to tuition rates and admission. So it's just sort of a historical categorization. I'll diverge from that quickly here and take a look at FTE by sector or campus type. And again, related back to history, we've grouped the community colleges, the 3 community colleges, separate from the 2-year colleges. They are all 2-year colleges, but for the sake of enrollment, often because it relates back to budgets and formulas, we split those out. And so here you can see the growth by sector, and that at our 4-year campuses, we've had, over a 10-year period of time, a growth of about 2,000 FTE, that's 7%. And then at the 2-year colleges, and this is, I'm going to say it, but it'd probably be the last time I do, formerly the COTs. I haven't had to say that for quite some time now. It was 2 years ago at this meeting when we adopted that. They increased by the same numerical amount, about 2,000 FTE over a 10-year period of time, and that's a 55% growth for the smaller numbers at the 2-year colleges. And then at the community colleges, we see a decline of about 300 FTE. And we can get into more of this as this presentation moves along. Here's a slide that I'll just quickly go by. This is the distribution between the 4-year, the 2-year colleges, and the community colleges, and the changes since 2004. It's basically an 80% of our FTE is at the 4-year colleges. It's changed from 83%. It moves slowly. FTE, if we were using head count, you would see a larger percentage shift to the 2-year because there's more part-time students. So at times you'll hear us say that 25% of the students enrolled are at 2-year colleges. And that's the reason for the difference there. So let's look at resident FTE, because that's really the point here in terms of what has changed, and we lost 1,000 FTE in residents. So where did it occur between the different campus types? And you can see that there's about 200 FTE decline at the community colleges, about 300 at the two-year colleges, and about 600 at our four-year colleges. So this is the second year in a row of this same trend. And I'm going to show you some data that relates back to some demographic information from Montana as we get further on into the presentation that'll give you some indication of why this is occurring. And then if you look down to the 10-year change in resident students, virtually all of the increase in resident undergraduate students, resident students period, occurred at our two-year colleges. They increased about 1,800 FTE in resident students, where the four-year colleges declined by about 700 FTE in resident students. And so I feel like we need to stop and talk about that just a second here. That is in my view, of working here for 8 years and working with the data and the Board of Regents, is exactly what we intended to have happen in terms of policies and practices that we enacted. One was a tuition freeze at all of those 8 years at our two-year colleges, some of those years at the four-year colleges, to create a separation in price. The next one was remedial education. We've strongly encouraged and in policy encourage all of the remediation to occur at the two-year colleges, so it's at a lower price and at a lower cost. And that has occurred as well over that same period of time. And then we also have dual enrollment, which we have a price cut that is at the two-year campus rate, and we're driving dual enrollment to occur at the two-year colleges, as well as our common course numbering effort to increase transferability and help students start at a two-year college. So all of these policy and practices and decisions made by the Board of Regents are reflected in this data. So non-resident FTE, most of it occurred at the increases occurred at the four-year colleges, as you'd expect. It's about 3,000 overall. Over a 10-year period of time. Then this is really just for your own kind of reading. I just rank the growth by numerical and by percent increase from 2013 to 2014. And at the top there, you see in numerical growth, Bozeman, Tech, Gallatin College, and in percent growth, basically the same categories. We had 4 campuses that grew from 2013 to 2014. And then over a 10-year period of time, what's occurred here? Numerically, Bozeman, and then followed by Missoula College and Western. Percent-wise, we have Missoula College at the top, Highlands College coming in, and then Western. So let's go back to the resident students. And we've known this for some time. I think it was probably maybe even 6 years ago, I stood in front of this board and said there's declining, natural decline in the number of students that are coming out of our public high schools. And then the recession hit at about the same time, and we gained students during the recession. People go back to higher ed, whether it be at the two-year level or the graduate level. They come back to higher education as a place to find more education, to get back into the workforce. And so we softened the blow of the decline of the high school student with the recession. And so for between 2009, 10, and 11, we're still hitting record enrollment marks while our high school numbers are declining. And then the recession, then the recovery, economic recovery starts to kick in, and those who would have been at a two-year college, for instance, find a job, and now we have a compounding decline in the number of high school students, because when an entering class has 300 less, and then another entering class has 300 less, you have actually 600 less in the pipe, and so you get that. That's where it's all kind of come to fruition now, and in 2013-14, the projected number of high school graduates, and you can get anywhere between 93 and 9,000, but I just stayed with a consistent source here from a regional source, and that's at 9,100, and you can see that we are projected to stay in this trough up until about 2018. These are pretty solid because it's not that hard to project. You just go back into the pipeline of K-12 and you can figure out how many we're going to have. And I don't want to say that we are only reliant upon the recent high school graduate to drive enrollment, but they are a big chunk of what that we serve in the university system, and so we're starting to see that effect in our enrollment. One more slide dedicated to that. So this illuminates it. Let's just take a look at first-time freshmen that are resident students. Now we've shifted over to head count, so it doesn't matter how many credits you take, we're just going to count you. In fall 2010, we had 5,600. Now we're down to 4,900 so that's a 4-year drop there. I mean, 4 years, we dropped about 800 students who were resident. That's just entering in the fall, so don't try to translate that back to FTE. So then let's neck those residents down to those who graduated within 3 years from high school. So those are your new, recent, kind of freshly minted high school grads. And you see that, yep, that's where it's at. There's 600 of those that dropped in every fall semester. And then what I wanted to show you here, though, was that if you take a recent Montana public high school grad, and so that's out of our public schools who graduate and immediately attend the university system in the fall, those numbers have also dropped by about 200. And then that gets down to what percent of the class are we capturing. You're not seeing the denominator here, but we've been capturing the same percent. So it's not like, the point of all this is that it's not because there's a failure of high school graduates to attend the Montana university system on either K-12's part or our part. We've been the same. It could get better, but we're still capturing the same percent. So the last slide here in terms of the data, I always want to point out dual enrollment. We're going to talk a lot about dual enrollment in Deputy Commissioner Seck's committee. I didn't really want to show this because we've been really trying to get spring up, but spring didn't go up in comparison to this last fall. There's a variety of reasons. I don't want to get into them at this point in time. I did learn a little bit here is that when you're working with dual enrollment, because of practices, it's best to look at academic year totals because of the practices varying between the campuses and changes that are occurring as we speak right now. So if you looked at this in an academic year basis, we're still making great headway. It's a little bit less than a 50% increase. So not to beat a dead horse too much, but I have summary points here in the back that basically break down everything I just said. I'm not going to cover all of them. One of the interesting ones, at least in my mind, because I like to put things in boxes, is the 10-year comparison of growth. All of the 2-year colleges grew over the past 10 years. Half of the 4-year campuses grew. None of the community colleges did. It just fell into those categories, and so I thought I would point that out. Then the resident students, we talked about the natural decline, the effect of the economy, and dual enrollment as well. And Mr. Chair, that concludes my report. I'd be glad to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. Questions from the board? Questions from the board? Thank you.
Mr. Chair, we'll move on to the next item, research initiative. Would just like to give everybody a little perspective. About 8 years ago, following or at the tail end of a board retreat, Commissioner Stearns would remember this, we had quite a conversation in Great Falls about what education should look like moving forward. And we felt like for a long time, we were certainly within our element in the 4-year education world. We felt like we could make improvements in 2-year education and ultimately graduate education and research. I think in the last 8 to 10 years, we've come a long ways, as the numbers indicate, in 2-year education. We've done so with some great effort and adding staff that is directly related to that under John Seck's leadership and Mary Moe before him. I think we have made tremendous headway in that. Starting a couple years ago, we have sort of been on a charge to do a very similar thing when it comes to research and graduate education, and it's been a priority of mine. And I think when Deputy Commissioner Moisey was hired, we said this is an important area, and we want to be able to look back at some point in time and say we've made the kind of headway in research and graduate education that we have in 2-year education. And I think ultimately that will complete or enhance our overall portfolio of education in Montana. And so we've been on a track for several years to align those. We've added Ron Muffick to that area of the world. Neil's going to speak here in a moment on a new position that we're adding directly related to research. We've tried to coordinate that, and we ultimately anticipate more changes moving forward. Interestingly enough, I think that the Main Street Montana project, authored by or co-authored by one of our newest members, I think really sort of validates the track we were on. Two of the 5 pillars at least appear to me to speak directly to two-year education and research. And I think it says these are areas that are important in Montana and important to the Montana economy, and they're areas that higher education needs to focus. I think we have a lot of momentum in the two-year sector, and we have the TAC grant that will lend itself very well to that, and Deputy Commissioner Seck has his team well on board. I think we need a very concise but deliberate approach toward where we will go with research, and we've asked Deputy Commissioner Moisey to do that, and here in a moment I'm going to ask Dr. O'Brien to sort of give her perspective on where we're going that. But I wanted to at least introduce where I think we're headed with a research initiative. Overall, we will try to grow this area with or without, but ultimately we see that this potentially leads to a sort of major initiative and ultimately legislative initiative request for the MUS, as we've discussed sort of at a high level over the last year. We're trying to put some color behind that, some depth behind it. We've had Deputy Commissioner Moisey working with the 2 research VPs at the, or I should say 3, Missoula, Bozeman, and at Tech have been working to try to bring that message forward and really put some arms around it and some depth behind it. And so I'd ask Deputy Commissioner Moisey to just sort of briefly tell us where we're going on that initiative.
Thank you, Commissioner, Chair, members of the board. We have been working with the 3 VPs of research at MSU, and Montana Tech. And in fact, they served on the search committee for our new research director, who we're in the process of hiring based on board approval here in the next 2 days. And Cindy Orser is the candidate there. She will be in Montana next week, visiting the research campuses, has 25 years of research experience, both as a faculty member working with the private sector, and also will be involved in our research tour that's occurring in July this year as we tour the different research campuses. I'd like to thank our new Regent for his work on the Main Street Montana project. That has been very helpful in terms of making it clear that for economic development in the state, we need to have both the state, the university system, research capacity, and the private sector working together to fully realize what that economic potential and educational potential is for the state. And in fact, there was a recent study by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that really indicated that states that have those 3 areas working together in terms of policy and the research capacity in the state and the private sector are those that are going to grow the most in the next 10 years. So that's where we're hoping to go at least in the next few months and as we get into the next legislative session. Thank you, and I'll stand if there's any questions further on that.
First one, so I may not get it right. Can you explain to us a little bit more about what the role of the person that you're about to hire for at the commissioner's office with respect to research? What's her charge? What's the job look like relative to the campuses?
Regent Johnstone, she will. So the position is the state research director. She will interact both within the university system, but also with our Science and Technology Committee, which is a statewide committee that is made up of research representatives from the university system, also from the private sector, and also for some of the federal agencies, the Forest Service, for example, the healthcare industry. She will also really drive how do we make those bring those partnerships together How do we work with the legislature in terms of their potential involvement, and also bringing and identifying the public sector, corporate and private interest foundations and so on. And so she brings a strong background in that area, and that's really probably something that will be very new in Montana as we try to engage those different constituencies in a much broader scale than we have in the past, and especially within the university system.
Further questions from the board? Further questions? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, the last thing I would mention on that is members of the board, you'll be receiving a save the date very soon, but in preparation of sort of kicking off this entire research initiative, we have planned a little bit of a tour of some of the research facilities at our campuses, and also a visit at the Montana Resources Mine in Butte for July 14th and 15th. And we're right at the cusp of sending out those save the dates, so we are still in the midst of planning that, but we anticipate probably starting in Bozeman and looking at the facilities there, and then taking the WashCorp train to Missoula and looking at the facilities there, and then back to Butte to see what's going on in Butte, and ultimately visit the mine there, which I think all will be pretty interactive as to what research can do for the state of Montana and can do when it's coordinated with the Montana University system. So we're really looking forward to that, and I think it'll be a great introduction for old and new board members to get acquainted and reacquainted with the incredible research activity that's going on already in the state of Montana and the potential that it brings. We have had between $160 and $200 million worth of primarily outside funds that come to Montana that employ a lot of people and create a lot of good things. And so that is the driver behind what we're trying to do, and we hope to have an opportunity to show you all what's going on in the state very soon. I think if it's all right, we'll just skip to the governor's report. As we're sort of on the Main Street Montana topic and others, and I know that Dr. O'Brien is going to hit some of that. It is worth noting that I had the pleasure of attending the University of Montana commencement ceremony on Saturday, and our very own Dr. O'Brien was hooded during that ceremony for her recently attained PhD. So again, congratulations on that achievement.
Thank you, Commissioner. Chair Tuss, Regents, it's a great day to be here, and the governor sends his gratitude. He is particularly grateful for Regent Johnstone and Regent Sheehy, newly on board, and recognizes the longevity of the commitment to be a member of the Board of Regents, as well as the diligence that's needed to make these important decisions. And with this time of graduation, the governor is, and the lieutenant governor have both been at numerous campuses, and it's really a time of reflection and recognition of the hard work that goes in to these 40,000 students that Mr. Trevor reported about, and not only the diligence of the rigor and the integrity of the coursework, but also the humanness of working with these students who are overcoming all sorts of challenges and barriers to make sure that they are successful. So thank you from the governor. I would like to pass out to the Regents a copy of the Main Street Montana report. You can pass those around. As mentioned earlier, Regent Johnstone was one of the co-chairs, along with co-chair Larry Simpkins. This was a project that began about a year ago, and over 3,000 Montanans took part in the effort to contribute perspectives of what Montanans need for economic development. And the governor looks at this report that was, I see Regent Johnstone passing it along. I think you might have it memorized. Great deal of work was put in place here. Of those, well over 3,000 participants, over 55% were from representing private industry. And the governor recognizes this report essentially as marching orders for a strategic plan for economic development. I would like to turn your attention to page 10 of the report. Page 10 lays out 5 Main Street Montana project pillars. These are kind of emerging themes that came from the input of the constituents, and the very first one is, the first one and the last one are the two that in particular I would like the regents to be aware of. The first one, train and educate tomorrow's workforce today, which is align the educational system with the needs of a changing economy. Engage private-public partnerships to provide job training, apprenticeship, and professional development opportunities, and provide a lifetime continuum of quality education from preschool through adulthood. The Montana University system is poised well and is right on track from the governor's perspective for this pillar. Particularly with that TACT grant and pulling together representatives from private industry, both at the executive level as well as the grassroots level, making sure that on the ground, at the local level, that students and faculty are aware of the needs of private industry right now and what skills and knowledge are needed for those students to be productive in the workforce, and that we are, as a state and an education system, responsive to those needs of the workforce. And additionally, provide a lifetime continuum of quality education from preschool through adulthood. As you've heard me report before, early childhood care and education is a very high priority for the governor. We will be working with the governor to roll out a plan to support both pre-K, 4-year-old level, and ages 0 to 3 as well. Research overwhelmingly shows that children who are well prepared and have a high quality early learning experience before kindergarten are significantly more likely to be a benefit to the economy. They are 70%, children who do not have a quality early childhood learning experience are 70% more likely to be arrested of a violent crime by the time they're adults. That is one of many statistics that you probably have heard before and will continue to hear as we move forward. Additionally, on page 11, the 5th pillar, nurture emerging industries and encourage innovation. These are points that Commissioner Moisey already pointed out to us, that research is directly linked to economic development, and we have seen throughout the state industry clusters build based what seems to be correlated in response to a development of faculty in those areas. The laser industry in Bozeman, and now newly emerging technologies in Missoula, as well as others throughout the state. And there is significant research nationally that shows states that have invested in research, those dollars are a phenomenal leverage for additional funding of research. So the governor will be, and this project and the citizens will be sending more information your way. If you, again, and the, I already mentioned the TACT grant and how that's in alignment, but also that Complete College Montana, the governor set forth in his State of the State address a goal of 40 to 60% of Montanans earning some type of post-secondary degree, and the governor's very grateful for the work of the commissioner's office and the campuses for efforts in and creative efforts, and really, quite frankly, nationally leading experiences in dual enrollment, creative scheduling, EdReady, which is showing very strong increase in and success in developmental education, and we're ahead of the game in performance-based funding. With that, I will just reiterate that he's very grateful for your work, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them.
Thank you, Dr. O'Brien. Are there questions from the board for Dr. O'Brien? Questions? Regent Johnstone, thank you for your involvement in this. This is a great product. Thank you very much. President Engstrom.
Let me just make a couple of quick comments. One, for somebody that believes in the power and value of education for a whole bunch of reasons, including economic development, this project was an extraordinarily confirmation of those ideas and those beliefs. We went all over Montana, from Ekalaka to Troy, virtually. And the one strong, consistent message that we received, regardless of who we talked to, whether we talked to farmers, whether we talked to small business owners, whether we talked to manufacturers, whether we talked to nonprofit corporations, whether we talked to governmental entities, the most consistent theme we heard was the importance of education to economic development. Now, different constituencies see different characteristics and components of education, from apprenticeship programs through graduate programs, but that was the consistent theme that we saw without any question, and from all constituencies in the state. So I think that was a confirmation, I think, for me, and it should make everybody in this room feel very good. And the second thing I want to note is that I think there was an editorial comment in one of the newspapers that this report suggested that the university system should be put under the province of the Department of Commerce. That's not true. We like the university system right where it is, so thank you.
President Engstrom.
Mr. Chair, members of the board, I would just like to make a comment to reinforce the last two presentations, the nexus of what Dr. O'Brien was talking about and what Deputy Commissioner Moisey was talking about in the research project. The research component of Main Street, Montana, and the initiative that the board is moving forward on is so important for a variety of reasons, and I just wanted to emphasize some of those. If you think of the research effort within the Montana University system, it is quite the industry in and of itself. If you think of the $200 or so million a year that the system does in research with money other than state funds, where does that money go? Probably 60 to 70% of that $200 million goes directly into wages, salaries and wages for somebody that's working in Montana. So I mean, it injects a huge component of just money into the system, and quite a bit of the rest of the money is spent locally as well. So of that $200 million, roughly, that's a huge influx to the economy of the state of Montana, just for the industry of research in and of itself. But secondly, that research leads to products, to services, in many cases companies that further amplify the economy and the quality of life that we enjoy in Montana. So the spin-offs that we see in some of our cities and towns that come from university research builds new companies and employs people that would have to otherwise leave the state in many cases. So it's important from that point of view. And thirdly, and we can't lose sight of this part of it, research is one of the best forms of education that you can have. The research that we do, I want to emphasize to everybody, involves students at every level, whether they're undergraduate students, graduate students, in many cases even high school students and postdocs and so on. So it's a critical part of the educational process as well. And I just want to take the opportunity to emphasize that we don't do research in isolation from education. They're very closely tied to one another, very supportive of one another, and it reflects a healthy higher education system to see the synergy between the educational, the research, and even the outreach component of this. So if I might just, this recent $45 million grant that Rick Hauer at our institution received, again, probably something approaching over the years of that grant, 40 million of that will find itself directly into salaries and wages. It will spin off perhaps some economic development activities, and it certainly will be an important component of the outreach and service that the university does and the Montana University system does. So I'm really happy to see the connection between Main Street, Montana, and the research effort that the system is undertaking. Thank you.
Thank you, President Engstrom. Regent Robinson.
Thank you, Chairman Tuss. Dr. O'Brien, I want to thank you for bringing this forward, and if you would please send our thank you to the governor as well, Governor Bullock, because I think this does a lot of things. One is obviously the effort that it took to help put this together is recognized, but it gives a true roadmap for the entire state and how our university system works into that roadmap. I think it's important because those of us that work within these arenas, and I've worked in economic development quite a bit, that it's important to have this in front of us so that it helps guide us in our decisions. So all of the work that was done to put this in place is fantastic, and now it gets to be implemented, or is actually getting implemented as we speak right now, as we talk about the TAC grant and the impact that it can have here in the state of Montana. So it really is a great tool that's been compiled together, utilizing the whole state of Montana. And in addition, I do want to thank Regent Johnstone for your efforts as well with this, because in the same sense, it's something that I think that will help us on our decisions here on the board, but it'll help, more importantly, I think it'll help Montana and those that want to be a part of this plan and this roadmap, how they fit into that picture. So it's good to have this out there. So thank you for all of the work that was done on this.
Regent Krause.
Thanks. It was a good overview. I downloaded this a couple of weeks ago and read it through. And it occurs to me we talk a lot about ROI, and that's certainly return on investment, and that's certainly one way to look at it all, right? I think whether it's early childhood education or higher ed or all the education in between, that what we're really talking about is helping Montanans, individual Montanans, reach their potential. Maximizing our potential as individuals and humans, and I sometimes we get lost in the ROI sauce and economic development, but when we're a happier state and when we're working to our potential. When our society has people working at their potential, we'll succeed as a state in a way that that leaves ROI in the dust and leaves. And so it was a little bit to support Regent Johnstone's comment about the Department of Commerce. This is about reaching human potential, and I see that as our job up here. And when we do that individually with Montanans, that's when our state becomes successful and our society becomes successful, and that's how we're going to do it. And so Main Street it's not just about Main Street here, right? It's about every day and everywhere in Montana.
Commissioner. Oh, I'm sorry.
Chair Tuss, members of the board, Dr. O'Brien, I just want to comment that we can't overlook the fact that this is an exciting time. And really, in looking in our history, a time of synergy where we aren't working in silos. We are working hand in hand with the support of the governor's office, working as an educational system hand in hand, and also with the citizens who have ownership in this. And I think it gives us the potential to really take advantage of the opportunity to move the dial because of that synergy. So I thank you for that, because I certainly have seen with past leadership that there wasn't always that sort of synergy and ownership. What an opportunity, what an exciting opportunity for us. Thank you.
Commissioner?
Mr. Chairman, we will move to affordability indicators. Thank you for that.
Mr. Chair, I wanted to
Mr.
add
Cruzado.
something, and that is, I also want to add my voice of support to this document, but it's almost like getting married. That day is not the culmination, it's the start. This document is not the culmination. It's a start of a process. And it will be very important for all of us around the table and around the state of Montana to take this document seriously enough to start implementing it expeditiously. Too many good strategic plans end up at the bottom of a file cabinet. We cannot allow that to happen. Too many hours, too many precious resources of time and energy and resources and hope are behind this document. So it's important for us at the universities, and it's important for us with the Board of Regents to make sure that now we take this document and move it from the mechanic to the organic, and we breathe it, and we infuse life to it. I like to quote Jim Collins a lot, and I always like to say that there are 3 things that we need to do, and that's we need to have disciplined thought, which is this. Now we need disciplined people, disciplined action, so that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, not only we feel very satisfied, but people around the nation say, what's going on in Montana? How did that happen? Well, today is just a day of new beginnings. Thank you.
Thank you, President. Commissioner?
Thank you all for that good discussion. I think this research initiative has certainly been at the top of our plate and will continue to be. I think we've got a lot of good momentum as we move forward, and hopefully we can capitalize on that. So I think we'll go to the next topic, which is affordability indicators. And there's probably a question as why is this on our plate today? And I will tell you, love it or hate it, this is sort of where the cycle goes. And as a previous board member, all the meetings were busy and had lots on our plate, but there's one every other May following the legislative session when we have to approve budgets and tuition. And that is, that's when you earn your $50 a day right there. That's the big buck day, because you've got to find a way to balance the ultimate question of affordability and access and quality and fairness and all those things that go into that May discussion. What's the right thing for students? What's the right thing for Montana? How much do we carry on the backs of students? How much do we carry on the backs of faculty and staff that work within the system? And that is a tough debate. And how far can we push the good luck of that's been afforded to us in our ability to recruit and retain the quality that has made the Montana University system what it is, and the quality people that are involved in it. We truly are blessed with what we have, and that balance is a difficult one. So, you know, there's already been, in a few meetings we've had in the last few days, some talk of affordability and where we go next. And as we start moving this process forward, you'll have a good discussion about our next biennial budgets moving forward. And I think that you need to start with the perspective of sort of where we stand on the affordability front. And so we've asked Deputy Commissioner Trevor to put together some indicators that will give us sort of a starting point, both how we rank amongst our peers, but also I think an extremely important part of this conversation is what does that mean for Montana? I mean, it's one thing to say what does it mean for Wichita or what does it mean across the nation, but what does it mean for Montana and Montana families? and how ultimately are you going to make those decisions to balance that? So, Tyler?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, at the risk of hitting you with the data fire hose, we're going to proceed with the affordability indicators. I will say I'm going to move quickly again, and just with a few disclaimers. This presentation will probably leave you with more questions than I answered. It does not provide a definitive conclusion on what to do, and it does not give you recommendations. That's not to say that we haven't been working on recommendations on what to do. An affordability task force was put together 3 years ago as the result of a version of this presentation. So there's another section that goes along with this. This presentation is merely the tools that the regents need, at least the beginning tools that the regents need to start to address the topic of affordability. I won't answer whether or not the university system is affordable. I can only give you the indicators. So with that said, I have 5 or 6 guiding questions that are intended to be answered with this. And that is, what does it cost for a resident full-time freshman who enters the university system? And I'm going to keep going back to that again, resident, first-time, full-time student, because that's the student that we index tuition prices off of. When we say the average price for a resident in an academic year at a 4-year campus is $6,000, we're talking about a freshman who enters and enrolls in 15 credits, or 12 credits for that matter, in both of those semesters. So I'm going to keep coming back to that. I'll remind you throughout that that's the group that most of the time we're looking at here. The other one is, how much financial aid does the average student receive? Because you cannot look at tuition or price in a silo. You have to look at financial aid as well. And then that leads to what's the net price, as well as then the whole area of student borrowing and student debt, and how we compare regionally and nationally throughout this, and longitudinal trends. So with that said, I'm going to dive in. Stop me at any point. This first slide is just basically fundamental academic year rates for resident first-time freshmen over a 10-year period of time. They're not adjusted for inflation. This is straight brass tacks to you, published tuition and fees and grouped in aggregate by the flagship campuses, UM and MSU, and then our 4-year regional campuses, Tech, MSUB, Western, and Northern, and then our 2-year colleges, including the community colleges. And so you can see the change there. I would point out from 04 to 07 is where most of that increase occurs. If you start in 08 and move forward, it's pretty flat. Quickly then, comparing our averages to the WICHE average, or the regional average in the West, the 14 states in the West. 2-year colleges, we're right at about the average. 4-year colleges, we're now below the average. And I say now because it's only been the last couple years that 4-year and the flagship doctoral research campuses have actually been below the regional average. Back in 06, that was a primary goal of the regents, was just get to the average. And so throughout the recession, as state appropriations were declining in other states, it was not atypical for in a single year to increase tuition by 20%. And that's reflected in this chart. When you compare the 10-year percent increase of tuition and fees, we lead the West, no doubt about it. At the 2-year level, we grew at a slower pace than anybody. At the 4-year regional campus level, we grew at a slower pace than anybody. And then when you get to the flagship doctoral research campuses, we grew at a slower pace than anybody except Wyoming, which was at 42%. Most of them were around 100%. If you went across this nationally, that would go up. You would see states that increased by 200%. With that said, we have a particular problem in Montana when it comes to median household income, and we all know what that is. It's low. And so when we take our tuition rates, we need to balance them with that fact. And so this is a pretty typical measure. It's the ratio of tuition and fees to median household income. What percent of household income is made, would tuition and fees account for? And so you compare that, what we have there in the dark blue, to the region, and you see that at our 2-year, we're still a little out of whack there. We're still on the high side on the 2-year. For the first time in at least 8 years, we've been slightly below the regional average at the four-year campuses and at our flagship doctorals. It's still not great, but we've made progress in relation to other states. It's mainly because they increased and we stayed the same. Okay, price of attendance. Don't get caught up in just tuition and fees. Anybody who has a son or daughter who has gone to college knows that it's more than just tuition and fees. You can look at it like this in general. Tuition and fees about $5,000. Room and board, I used to say was $5,000, but that's gone up with inflation, definitely. And so I'd say that's more like $7,000. I'd get you the $12,000 mark. Throw on another $1,000 for books now, and that is conservative. And now you're at $14,000. And you could stop there. Federally, we don't. In terms of getting financial aid, we tack on another $3,000 or $4,000 for other expenditures. But in this case, I stop there because other expenditures occur for everybody, regardless of whether you're in higher education or not. So to get to a true price of attendance, at least in my definition here, I give you the tuition and fees, the room and board, and $1,000 basically for books, and that's what you get, $15,000. As regents, you often get asked, what does it cost to go to school? For an academic year, the best answer for MSU and U of M is $15,000. And then it goes from there down to about $14,000 or $13,500 for our four-year regional and $10,500 for our two-year campuses. Okay, so now average amount of financial aid received. Financial aid here does not include student loans. Oftentimes you will see student loans in the average. Throw out loans. What we're talking about here is scholarships, grants, waivers, and work study. Things you don't have to pay back. You take a look back to 2003. This is not adjusted for constant dollars. It's just basically the average amounts by the three different types of institutions, and we're at an all-time high. That's not a surprise that it would increase. Waivers alone would grow just because the price of tuition would increase. But this is significant, and we've hit a point now where I'll talk about this slide first. Our average is about $4,300. And it's made a pretty significant jump even within the last year. Now, I'm playing on last year's data. I'm in academic year 2013. So I'm not sure where this year is. I'd imagine it's pretty close to this. But this is what's significant about it. 84% of the students now receive, so this is all students. This isn't just those receiving aid. There's some people with zero in this. So 84% of the students are getting $4,300. That's pretty good. That sounds really good, and that maybe you've seen a quote that I said in the paper, and is that, but don't think this applies to everyone. If you're of average income, of average ACT score, and this is sort of a description of myself and my kids as they go, and average athletic ability, you're likely not to get $4,300. You might get 1,000, 2,000, sure, there's definitely opportunities, but so it's an average, and there is definitely outliers. So quickly breaking that down, this stuff starts fascinating me. So why? Why has it grown? It was at $2,200 in 2003. Even with inflation, it's not going to get to $4,300. The first thing you point to is the federal government and the Pell Grants. Pell Grant eligibility and the amount students can receive for Pell went up pretty big time in about 2008, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. And you can see the growth here. Pell increased by 65%, but that still leaves another big chunk. And remember, we're only talking about first-time, full-time resident students here. This isn't part-time students, not non-resident students. It's just that group. Here's some of the reasons. Governor's post-secondary scholarship added $2 million. MUS Honors Scholarship was expanded for a 4-year period of time instead of just 1 or 2 years. Recruiting efforts to get these students, our shrinking pool of high school students. Don't think there's not a competition for those students and that dollars aren't being applied to that, because they are, and it's driving this. And then, of course, waivers. As the amount that you committed to waive grows, you're gonna increase the average financial aid amount. So enough with that. Let's quickly look at Pell and the growth of Pell. This is the percent of this same group, first-time, full-time resident students who receive Pell. You go back to 2003, and it was about 54% at the 2-year, and you see our average here is about 42%, and then it goes down over time. And this is as changes in Pell eligibility, the amount of available dollars did not follow the total cost of attendance. And in about 2008 and 2009, stimulus package from the federal government hit. Part of that was to increase Pell, and they did. And we see it basically take off again. And we're now at about 43% of this group, almost half. And at some campuses, two-year campuses, 65% of the students are receiving a Pell Grant, with the average amount being somewhere around $4,000. That's a big factor in our financial aid. We get about $70 million in Pell to our students that comes into the university system annually. You can't talk about financial aid without talking about state-funded financial aid and how we compare to other states. What does our state provide? And we're down here on this tail end with a lot of other Western states in terms of, so this is grant aid divided by the number of undergraduate students, and it turns out to be about less than $200 per student. The soundbite here is you could triple this and we'd be at about the national average. So that's a contributor in the amount of financial aid we have. We're not a big state-funded financial aid state. So quickly moving along, net tuition and fees. This is real easy to get to. You take that first slide I gave you and you just subtract the average amount of financial aid for all students. And that's why I used all students instead of just those receiving aid, is so we can get to this slide right here. What does it cost the average student when you factor in financial aid to go to school? It's about $2,000 at the flagship, about $1,200 at the four-year regional, and it's -14 and -400 at the two-year campuses when you're only looking at tuition and fees. Remember, that was only about a third of the cost. So if you do that same thing and you apply it to price of attendance, which includes tuition and fees, room and board, and books, this is where we're at with the net price. And you can see we're about $10,000 or $11,000, $10,000, $7,000. Been pretty flat over time. Financial aid definitely has been a contributor. The tuition free is definitely a contributor. Moving on into student debt. This is an intriguing area because while net price, you go back to that, or net tuition has gone down, the amount that students borrowed has gone up. And you wouldn't think there would be a relationship there, but there is. And if you go back to about 08 and 09, you see these big jumps here. And so this is what we're looking at here is that the first year amount that first-time, full-time resident students borrow on average. Of those who borrow, just those who borrow. Now, we're not talking about the full group. And we're up now to 58% of the students who come in that first year borrow $5,600. And so if they attend for 4 years, you do the math up real quickly, you can see that you're going to get up somewhere close to $25,000 in debt. But again, it's just the average, but at least what we're seeing here, when I started this, we were back about here in 2010. I don't know where this chart's headed. So in the last 4 years, it's leveled off. So then let's shift to just the graduates. Those who receive degrees are one-year certificates in applied science, our two-year associate degrees, and our four-year baccalaureate degrees. The dark blue is the most recent year, and then you back up 5 years from that, and you have 2009. You can see the growth in the amounts. The percents down here are the ones that are really impactive, I think. Go to the associate's degree. 73% of the students who earn a two-year degree will graduate with an average debt load of $20,000. So that's basically how this chart goes. You really then leaves you with, okay, was that good? Was it bad? I got to kind of have something to compare it to. So let's take a look let's go to our bachelor's degrees and recipients. And over time, compared to the nation, lo and behold, we've been a little bit higher than the national average. And you'll see this measured in a lot of ways. And I would warn people nationally trying to measure this when they pick up an institution like it has 2-year degree recipients inside of it, and you might see that the national average in debt load is $22,000. I'd be willing to bet that they've included 2-year and 4-year into the same category when that happens. We don't have the most recent year available. In 2012, we're at about the national average. So this is not atypical. Montana is not an atypical state. We know that we're a lower income state, so it is somewhat concerning. This is where it gets concerning, is when you split out the low income student versus the non-low income student. So let's go back to the total. Remember, the total was about $26,000 and 64% borrowing with a 4-year degree. If you go to the non-Pell student, so that's a federally defined level of low income. Either you're in it or you're not. So when you're not in it, you're a non-Pell student, and your average then is $21,000, and only 40% have loans. When you go to the Pell student, $29,000 is the average, and 90% have loans. Almost every Pell student has a loan, and the amount is almost $30,000. So does Pell help students? Absolutely. Does Pell cover the cost of attendance? No way. Those students, these students over here have parents also. I've taken out parent plus loans. That's a key point in this whole thing too. These students over here have parents that are likely to take out plus loans and pay for them. These students are not. Moving on, does it affect success of these students? No doubt about it. This is retention rates, graduation rates. They're lower for low-income students. I'm just jumping in conclusion here. It probably has something to do with paying for college. Finally, the last slide. This is the one that's sort of an eye shocker, I guess. Look at the purple line. That's the total amount in loans. Grow up to $23 million now. Started at, what, about half that amount. 100% increase. We have unsubsidized and subsidized loans. Those make up the most. The unsub is for students that are, or the sub is for students who are identified as low income, and the government will pay your interest while you're in school, and the sub is not. There's been a split there. I believe it's because of graduate students no longer are able to get subsidized loans. This quickly gets very complex. Down here on the other, you got plus loans, and you also have private loans that you can get from a private bank. Okay, so in past, I've not even summarized points out of this thing because it's just it's like getting hit by a shotgun, and I totally realize that. Total tuition and fees, we're relatively low at our 4-year campuses when compared to other states. We're about average at 2. Tuition rates, they've increased at a slower pace than almost anyone, and I would put us up against any state in the nation. That's only going to look better as we get to about 2007 as the base because we froze tuition starting then often. Financial aid availability is at a 10-year high. Borrowing amounts, at least in the first year, have leveled off, but that still doesn't mean that total loan amounts for graduates haven't continued to climb. And Mr. Chair, that concludes my report. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to ask Commissioner Stearns to make a quick comment as well.
Thank you very much. When I had the good fortune, I guess almost a month ago, with several of you and you, Tyler, to go to Indianapolis, where there was a capstone convening of the College Now project. And one of the things we were able to do, especially, actually, I was told I had to do, Deputy Commissioner John Seck, was we told our Montana story to a number of other states. And what we found was the most sort of surprise, bordering on disbelief from our colleagues in the other states, was related to bullet number 2. And Tyler referred to it earlier when he showed the flat tuition increase in Montana. So it really is a point of light, the fact that for the 2-year institutions, they really could hardly believe that we had frozen tuition during those years, and they asked, well, then what happened? And I'm sure all of our colleagues at the 2-year colleges would say, we took some hits with that because we did not receive maybe all the tuition revenue we would have liked, but for the most part, members of the board, what you did and what the governor's budget did was to seriously make an effort to backfill, to fill in what the campuses would have lost or would have lost without those tuition increases. So do it. So that is one of the points of pride, I think. And I think, you know, I would call Tyler and John Seck to back that up. I will say that for Commissioner Christian, who was serving on the board during that time, one of our points of disappointment over those same years was that we could not move the dial more in terms of state-based, low-income-based increase of aid to supplement Pell Grant income for our students. And I think that really comes through loud and clear on these indicators. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Stearns. We'd stand for questions on this.
Chair Tuss, I did have one question. One question is the cost of education. The other question, or another metric, is the value of education. And there are national statistics that suggest that the value is pretty substantial. Have we done any analysis of our graduates to see how we compare nationally in the relationship between the cost and the value?
Mr. Chair, Regent Johnstone, great question. By and large, the answer is no from the system level. I would say from individual programs such as Montana Tech and engineering and petroleum and engineering like that, they may have got to data at that level. We do match with our graduates with the Department of Labor Unemployment Insurance Wage Database, so we can come up with the average salaries that our grads have. But to do that in relationship to those who received a high school education, and we have not got to that information, no.
Further questions from the board? Regent Robinson.
Chairman Tuss, thank you, and thank you for the report, Tyler. I had a couple questions. One is related to Pell Grants, and if you're aware nationally, I mean, it sounds like it's kind of leveling off from what you have indicated. What do you know as far as what's anticipated with those Pell Grants? I mean, we're largely dependent upon Pell Grants here in the state, and do you anticipate that that's going to, the funding is going to stay available for that, or if it's going to decrease or increase?
Mr. Chair, Regent Robinson, back up 3 years, we heard a lot of talk about Pell decreasing, even up until the last recent year. We haven't heard so much about that lately. Although I think the decision was made maybe 4 or 5 years ago, the Pell amount is going to take an uptick, small one, by about $200 to $5,700 as the max. It's at like $5,550 right now. So that's a good indication that it's still moving in the right direction. Although I know the amount of money to fund Pell is always a big consideration in the overall budget, and so things can change. But I would say right now we look pretty stable.
Mr. Chair, I would say it's your staff. We find an opportunity to meet with our congressional delegation often, our DC delegation, and that is always the top of the priority list. Pell is extremely important to us in Montana, especially in the two-year sector. I mean, we literally cannot do it without it, and the burden on families would be incredible. If that goes away in part or in all, it is a fairly catastrophic event for a number of reasons, and so we continue to push that agenda as every opportunity we get. But that's an important one for us all to keep sort of on the front burner as we find opportunities to do that.
Further questions from the board?
I do have a follow-up, if I could, Mr. Chairman. It's related to this because it actually relates to your previous presentation on enrollment, too. When we take a look at the two-year colleges and the growth that we've seen by design in those enrollment numbers, and yet at the same time, what we're seeing here, obviously, is there in one of your slides, it showed an actual decrease in that tuition, a negative. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about it, because that's one of the areas that we're seeing the largest growth in actual numbers of enrolled students. And yet, could you explain that a little bit more, why we're seeing that decrease in the actual tuition? I know that we're talking about, we've been voting on this a number of times on freezing tuition, but how does it relate to a decrease?
Yeah, and Mr. Chair, Regent Robinson, so when we go to net tuition, you can see that it's just gone down since we started freezing tuition. So there's more of a correlation between tuition amounts at the two-year campuses because they're higher and they're making up a larger percent of the overall cost of attendance for those students. They're higher relative to the overall cost. And so we froze tuition. Pell then increased significantly, and these students are also more likely to receive Pell. So Pell, the growth of Pell and the effect on financial aid is greater at a two-year campus. So now, and you know, we have some other, there's components of the governor's scholarship that go to need-based aid. We have some state aid that goes there. It probably didn't pay as much of an effect on this. But this is a growth of Pell and freezing tuition effect. Again, it's just a tuition, but this is a really good, great sign and something we should use as a marketing tool to get people to go to two-year campuses is that the tuition amount up front, there is aid. Now, again, it's average. And so, you know, maybe the part-time mother with 3 kids at home isn't getting the same amount as these, so this is great, but then you factor in what you got to do to live while you're going to school full time. Because remember, these are full-time students too, and full-time students only make up a fraction of the students at the two-year campus. But you got to then come up with somewhere in the order of $6,000 to $7,000 if they had dorms. That's what you would pay to stay in it, but you're not, and it's probably every bit, or if not higher than that. So the full cost is much higher. And that's when you see the net price.
That, Mr. Chair, that for those of us that aren't quite as thrilled about data as Tyler is, which is most of us in the room, Tyler always feels compelled to show that slide because it's one that's used nationally. And a lot of national reports come out with this the net number, which is tuition minus the financial aid. But I've always found it to be one of the most confusing slides too, because it doesn't have a lot of meaning in actuality. It's an important number, but translates to nothing when it comes down to a student. Nobody's putting money in their pocket and attending college. It's an effect of what we charge for tuition less the financial aid. But I think this slide here, the net price of attendance is much more valuable to you as board members. That's what families are having to take out of their pocket to attend. And those are important numbers, and I think the later slides show you where that also is a pretty big chunk out of a Montana pocket. And so that's the piece that I think we really have to be cognizant of.
Just my final comment is you know, we're seeing, as we're talking about this morning, an increase in our two-year colleges in the enrollment, and yet, you know, keeping our tuition freeze there obviously is important to make it affordable. I think there's a point where it can start to hurt our institutions too if they don't have the ability to operate and to provide the quality education that we're promoting out there and that we do have. I think in addition, we're also seeing that we're at almost the bottom of the rung with state funding. And as far as being able to provide any type of scholarships and things like that at the right place. I know we'll probably talk a little bit about that with performance-based funding and what's going on there later on today, but I think that's something that we need to keep in mind as board members that, you know, at some point, we shouldn't be sacrificing what quality of education that we're offering to. So it's important to keep in mind.
Thank you, Regent Robinson. Regent Krause.
Thank you, Chair. Was there, other than the recession, was there a change in how we measured or a change in how we, of a regulation or something in 2008, 2009, between 7 and 8, that accounts for the change in debt incurred, or is it just the recession, or is it, what is that?
Mr. Chair, Regent Krause, there was a change. The debt ceiling that students were able to borrow up to went up. And I don't know the exact numbers, but it was a pretty significant increase. And it flows almost directly with Sorry for me to surf around inside this thing.
No.
This chart right here. This is basically the debt ceiling on a first-time, full-time resident student. You can borrow from the feds up to $5,500. This is the average, and you have independent students in here as well, but it's predominantly a dependent student. And so independent students can go a lot higher. But so this was the debt ceiling down in pretty close to the debt ceiling, and then you see it gradually go up and hit the debt ceiling again. So it's an indication, at least an indicator of when you allow students to borrow and they have the ability to go to the top, they do it.
And if I may add, I also think that in addition to that, there was another piece of regulation that impact these numbers, and that is when we moved to direct lending. So when we moved to direct lending, we did that without the necessary safeguards in place. So virtually there was no penalty for the student who defaulted in their loan. And we have seen around the nation so many students that actually decided to go to college, not only because the economy was bad and they needed to pursue a degree, but because that was a place in which they could get a loan quickly, and health care as well.
Regent Sheehy.
How are these numbers used in recruiting? Do you have any interface with the recruiting department as far as telling people and potential students, especially those from Montana, about our affordability? Is there anything going on both in the system and at the individual branches?
Mr. Chair, Regent Sheehy, that's an excellent question. And that, I alluded a little bit to the Affordability Task Force, which basically is a fancy way of saying financial aid folks, some admissions folks, that gets to the recruiters, the student affairs people, and some data people getting together to talk about what influences affordability, what type of recommendations could we make to the regents, and how can people market and explain to parents and students the real price. And I know at both of our flagship campuses, the effort to get students to enroll in 15 credits because we have a flats, but we charge the same amount between 12 and 18. That's directly related to this type of work. And getting that information in the hands of folks. I don't have the definitive answer on how well we do when recruiting, although we've made some strides. I'm sure we could do more. Mr. Muffick, our Director of Student Services and Financial Services, works with that group, and he's here, and I know it's on his radar.
Well, I have a senior in high school, and I can tell you that this information isn't going into the Montana high schools with the vigor that you're presenting it. It would be helpful to get that information with the kind of excitement and the understandability that we're receiving it today.
Yeah.
Not that you can go to all the high schools.
Deputy Commissioner, can you talk about, I know that we're going to have a piece about a new potential financial literacy product that we're going to be discussing a little bit later on in today's agenda. But can you talk about the importance of that as it relates to this debt? I mean, have you seen a connection here? Is there a connection?
Mr. Chair, we would love to say there's a direct connection between that chart right there and the leveling off of student borrowing with our financial literacy efforts, but that would be a stretch. Here's what, in the last couple years, campuses have, this is so me ad-libbing opinion, campuses have dabbled in financial literacy leading up to a couple years ago when the topic really kind of has bubbled up. Affordability Task Force, right there in the middle of that. And we took a grant from the governor's office, it was a federal grant funneled through the governor's office to the university system to ensure that every campus could get going some form of financial literacy. And that we actually we took proposals from campuses and funded up to $80,000 per campus based upon size, I think, and gave them kind of the startup money to get people dedicated to it, get some processes in place, get the targeted, we wanted it to be targeted with a small amount of funds, you want to target the people that need the most. And so we have a variety of different success projects that we could explain. We've liked to say that we use a consistent and collaborative approach, so people learn from other campuses, which is the best way to do things. This group comes together annually and receives their grant, talks about it, but it's ratcheted up one more notch, and you're going to hear about that in the Student Affairs report from Mr. Muffick about the consistency and how that wraps into other types of training for first-time students. So I hope that answered your question.
Regent Krause.
Thank you. Could you go back to the slide that had the Pell Grant recipients and the non-Pell Grant recipients and the debt that they're incurring? I can't remember where. There it is, right there. And so I look at this slide, and maybe I sounded unnecessarily philosophical on that last subject, but so when I overlay a slide like this about essentially Pell Grant recipients who are let's say that they're lower income, right? You have low to moderate income Pell Grant recipients. And if you look at this graph and then you think about the completion gap or the graduation gap that occurs between low income and middle and high income. So there's the difference in completion rates or graduation rates between non-Pell and Pell. They're inversely proportional, and so what you end up with, I think, is this emphasis on getting people to finish school, right? Because the debt may not matter as much if the value of the education is good, as Regent Johnstone said. If you get good value, the problem is that 40% or whatever it is completion gap between people that aren't borrowing, maybe, whatever it is, the graduation rates, it's only 14% there. But if you overlay those two on top of each other, you're sending a lot of people with debt out of college without a degree. And I think that's one of the things that I saw in those two really is, one of the things I saw in those two, there's 14% more people are leaving without a degree and they're leaving with more debt. And that's, I think that is an issue for us we need to put those two issues together as we talk about policy in the future.
Thank you, Regent Krause. Further, Regent Regala.
Thank you so much for the data, Tyler. Appreciate it. And Jeff, never apologize for getting too philosophical at the Board of Regents meetings. We greatly appreciate it. And so, Tyler, this is a question just on affordability indicators. Has student default rates ever been considered as an indicator?
Mr. Chair, Regent Rogella, yes. And I believe that it is an indicator. It's also an indicator of students' ability to pay back, and the types of students that may default. And so it's a complex issue. I believe we had charts here last Regents meeting on the increasing default rates.
And just for Regents Sheehy and Johnstone, we had a significant conversation about the students' increasing student loan default rate in Montana. Historically, in 2004, I believe we led the nation with a default rate of somewhere around 1.6, 1.8%. Now we're up to about a 16% student loan default rate. And we had a significant conversation about how that relates to the loans that students are taking out in regards to the quality of the education that they're receiving and their ability to pay back on that student loan. So at least for me, that'd be really helpful if I could compare debt load to payment rates, because then it can really help conceptualize at least the value of the expenses and benefits. But that'd be helpful for me.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. Commissioner.
Any other thoughts or questions on this? Well, important topic, and certainly one we will be wrestling with as we move the budget process forward. Mr. Chair, the campus reports are posted as we do every meeting, and we won't necessarily go through those one-on-one. So we, at this time, as normal, I hand it back to you early. Before we take a break, though, I would just say, for various scheduling reasons, we're going to move the board picture to right now. And so maybe we could even do it before everybody scatters on a break. We could just quickly get the picture done, and then we can move on.
Please, go ahead. Regent Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just had one question. I want to thank again all of our institutions for providing the reports, giving us highlights of what's happening on each of the campuses. We appreciate that. And there was one that we didn't have from Dawson Community College, and I was wondering if we were going to at least receive something so that we could review that. I don't know why it was absent.
Regent Robinson, Mr. Chair, we will follow up on that. It could very well be that we have new leadership there in place and just getting on the same page with all these things, but I will check and see if a report's available. If there is, we'll make it available to the board. If not, we will certainly get the communication line opened up so those are on future reports.
Further questions or comments about campus issues and reports? Seeing none. Is it appropriate then to take the break now and have the photo right now? Commissioner, is that your intent?
You're ready for the photo? We're ready for the photo, so let's just do that. And then we'll take a break as soon as we're done.
Then take our regular break.
Yeah.
We're at recess. And we are at that point in the agenda where we are at the Administrative Budget and Audit Oversight Committee. And with that, I will turn it over to Deputy Commissioner Robinson.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, you have in front of you the agenda for the committee meeting. First of all, we have a list of consent items that we've included on the agenda. The idea of the consent agenda would be that if board members do not have a specific item that they would want to pull off of the consent agenda, then we would just consider the consent agenda as a group. Just to talk a little bit about the due diligence that flows from our office in terms of each of these items, we do spend significant time looking at the items in terms of making sure they comply with Board of Regents policy. When we talk about the fees, one of the key areas we're looking at is to make sure that there is significant student involvement in the process in terms of fees, et cetera. But each one of these items we do spend a lot of time on, and we are satisfied that they have met the policy requirements of the board, et cetera.
Deputy Commissioner, thank you for that. I would remind everybody that the actual action items for all of this stuff, including one action item for the consent agenda items for every one of our committees, will be taken up tomorrow, as we always do on the second day of the Regents meeting. That will be Friday. Also, because we have not yet reconstituted all of the committees of this particular board, all of the various 4 committees that we have and will be hearing from over the next 2 days, we'll be treating as committees of the whole. Because literally some of our committees at this point have just a couple of people on them. And typically after leadership elections at this May meeting over the summer period, we put the new committees together, the new committee structure with the new members together. And so we will do that over the summer in consultation with every member of this board as well as the commissioner. So I would just remind everybody, as we talked about last night, all 4 of these committees will be acting as a committee of the whole, but the actions on all of these committees will take place tomorrow as per the agenda. Okay? Deputy Commissioner, is there anything else on consent agenda or questions perhaps from the board about particular items on the consent agenda? Regent Regala.
And so make this isn't a... John Sack is okay. Yeah. So Deputy Commissioner Robinson, this isn't a question, just a comment, and this deals with item I on the consent agenda, and for everyone else, they're not looking at the agenda, it's the authorization to separate part of ASMSU's student government fee and direct it towards the MSU Leadership Institute, which will commingle some university funding, as well as provide a bit of MSU executive oversight of the program. And I think this is exciting for Montana State to, I think, really allow for the Leadership Institute to develop a very substantive offering for the system, as well as combine with some of the initiatives that President Cruzado and her team are working with the Year of Engaged Leadership. And I think that's exciting and something that the Leadership Institute has been working towards for the last several years, in my opinion. And I think that's exciting for MSU. So just one comment.
Thank you, Regent Regala. Further questions on any consent agenda items? Seeing none, let's get into the action items. A, present law budget.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I've asked Frida Hauser, the University System Director of Accounting Budget, to flow through this particular item. And we're going to spend a little more time discussing the process that we use here, recognizing that we do have a couple of new board members, and we only see this once every 2 years, so it's important that we all have a good understanding of the process that's involved in moving this budget forward into the governor's budget process. So I'll turn it over to Frida.
Thank you. Members of the board, for the record, my name is Frida Hauser, Director of Accounting and Budgeting. It's great to be here in Havre. Earlier, Chancellor Limbaugh noted that the first classes began here in 1929. And on a personal note, I would just share with you that my grandfather attended school back then when it was a 2-year program, and he graduated in 1931. So I always enjoy coming to Havre. So with that, we'll get into the background of the budget process. And if we could bring up the item, actually bring up the item. Thank you. So what we're here today is to get your blessing to move forward with the state budget process. So in Montana, we have budgets that are built on a 2-year cycle and are submitted to the legislature that meets once every 2 years. So for example, the 2013 legislature approved our budgets for fiscal years 14 and 15. And currently, we are in fiscal year 14. It will end June 30th. So we already know our budget that we have for the next fiscal year, fiscal 15. So that brings us to the next 2-year budget cycle, and we are working on developing the fiscal year 16 and 17 budgets that will be presented to the 2015 legislature for approval. The governor's budget office is the one responsible for the executive process and coordinating the state development of the state budget. And it's about a year-long process. We started in January. We will have a final budget in November. There will be an opportunity for the governor's budget office to make changes in December, and then it will be presented to the legislature the following January. So we do have quite a few deadlines. Next week we have deadlines to input our present law budget request. And we are in the very early stages of developing that. At the March meeting, we went through an information item that kind of gave you a preliminary estimate of that. And since that meeting, I've been working with the campus budget officers to refine those amounts. And just to let you know, we have great budget officers at the campuses. And so I really thank them for their continued hard work, because these are large budgets and they get pretty complex. But they do a great job of analyzing the trends and making sure we have balanced and realistic budgets. So to meet the budget timeline, we are asking for approval through this action item. After the close of the fiscal year end, at June 30th, 2014, we will know exactly the starting point of our budget. So with the state budget process, the actual expenditures for fiscal year 14 become the starting point for the budgets for 16 and 17. When we're talking about the budgets, we are dealing with the current unrestricted funds of the campuses and the agencies. And the current unrestricted fund is comprised of tuition and state appropriations. Now, when we say present law, present law is defined as the level of funding to maintain operations and services at the current level. So what we're doing today, projecting that out into 16 and 17. So we're primarily looking at inflationary increases. The state definition does not include one-time only funding in the definition of present law. So any appropriations that the legislature restricted or tagged as one-time only will not continue. In order for those to continue, we must submit a budget request to get those authorized to continue. Also, present law doesn't include any pay plan funding. It only includes the pay plan that has been authorized in 14 going forward. So now if we could go to the assumptions page. So before we begin looking at the dollars amounts, just an understanding here of how the present law was put together. So we have some technical issues that we always run into when we're building the state budget. There's things that we pay as costs. We consider them part of our budget, but the state process doesn't recognize those as ongoing costs. And so I've listed some examples there of things that we have to request again. For example, faculty termination costs, the extension service county agent salaries. Primarily, there's salaries that are paid by federal funds and by designated funds, but the current unrestricted fund pays the benefits. So we are currently working with the governor's budget office to get those included in our budget. We also have things such as overtime and extra compensation and merit market things in union agreements that we need to request. Let's see. Personal services include health insurance increases and pay plan that have been authorized in 14 and 15. And we've also captured the cost of the faculty termination costs and merit and promotions in our numbers. In the operating costs, we are still waiting for some costs from the state for the fixed costs, so we haven't included those amounts in here. We will get those in the July timeframe. Utility costs are campus specific, and we utilize the utility projections that are done at Bozeman and Missoula to come up with those numbers. Other operating costs, we've pushed down and tried to keep those down related to inflation, and they've been limited to 2% for the educational units. Library acquisition, we've used an assumption of 7%, and the same for the information technology fixed costs that we have. So I have handouts here for you to look at because the numbers on the screen get pretty small, so if you could pass these out. Okay, so if we could bring up let's take a look at the graph. When we're talking about the state budget process, one of the first things we have to do is annualize the costs that were approved by the legislature in FY15 for those to continue into 16 and 17. Because the state uses a base budget concept of fiscal year 14, that fiscal year 15 increment gets missed. So it must be included as part of our budget request. And that's the blue bar that you can see in the graph. Then the red bar indicates what our request is for all the educational units. And by educational units, that includes the public colleges and universities, but it does not include the community colleges. So the red represents the present law increase for 16, and again, that must be carried over into fiscal year 17. And then the green bar represents fiscal year 17. So you can see that in a biennium budget process where you only develop budgets once every 2 years, you have a compounding inflation for the years. You have in 16, you have 2 years, and in 17, you're really at 3 years. Okay, so if we could look at just scroll down to the educational units. This is the cost that we have come up with for the current unrestricted fund. So the first column is the Regents approved budget for FY14. That was approved back in September. Then we've done a projection here of what we think the FY15 budget will be. Of course, those budgets won't be approved until September of this year. Then in the next column, we have tried to project, with the help of the campus budget officers, where we think our budget will be at June 30th, 2014. And then the next column shows what we're requesting as our present law base adjustments. And so that column would get added to our projected FY14. And again, these numbers will change once we close out fiscal year end and know exactly where the fiscal year 14 budget is. The highlighted column then is the total budget needed to operate the university system the way we are today. 17 are the 17 adjustments, and then that would be the total budget for FY17. So in the expenditures, if you look, we have personal services expenditures, and our personal services expenditures comprise a majority of our budget, right around 75%. The operating costs represent about 23%, and then we have some equipment purchases, and we have some transfers that we do, and basically transfers are setting aside money to purchase long-term equipment or computers, replacement of that. And that brings us down to our total expenses. So you can see the percent increase, that 4.81%, that's over 2 years. And then the percent in the next year, the biennium FY17, that 6.77%, that's an inflationary factor that encompasses those 3 years. So thinking back to the graph, that's how the percentages are come up with. So we have tried to keep it low, reasonable, tied back to inflation. The next column, below on the chart, the state share, what that represents is the amount of resident and WUI students to the total student enrollment, that 81.32%. So what we start out asking the state to participate at a rate that would cover the inflationary costs for resident and WUI students. And that's what we would consider a full funded request. Do you have anything?
Thank you, Frida. Just a couple of comments, and it deals with this relationship of the biennial budget and the present law computation. You saw with the bar chart that we do have that fiscal year 15 base that's included in our present law computation for each of the years 16 and 17. And one of the reasons I try to point this out is that as this dollar amount flows into the governor's executive budget process, we end up with what I view as really distorted percentage increases that the university system is asking for in terms of funding. And one of the reasons is because we do have to include that fiscal year 15 base, which has already been appropriated to the university system. So that has to be part of that present law computation. And then the other piece, as the budget is put together, the expenditure budget that you see in front of you is funded by a combination of tuition and state appropriations. And for fiscal year 14, the relationship is approximately, I think, 38% state funding and 62% tuition funding. So as our request shows in the governor's budget, the increase, that $17.7 million that will be our present law request for fiscal year 16, is going to be compared to only the state appropriation dollar amount, because tuition is not displayed anywhere within the governor's budget. So we end up with a comparison of a cost increase based on our total cost structure, but then that cost increase is compared to only a smaller portion of our revenue structure, just the state appropriation. So we end up with, in the governor's budget and also the legislative analysis, sort of these what look like significant increase from a funding request standpoint. But it's really this statutory structure, present law, the way in which the governor's budget is presented, the way in which the legislative analysis is presented. So we do get from time to time criticism regarding significant requests for increases, significant percentages, and so we have a responsibility to try to explain those requests. And it does become complicated because it is different from most of the other, all of the other executive agencies because of the tuition structure that we have in this particular fund.
Okay, and then if we could move on to the next spreadsheet, which details the agency's present law budget request. So our public service and research agencies are comprised of the Agricultural Experiment Station, the Extension Service, Fire Services Training School, Forestry Conservation Experiment Station, and the Bureau of Mines. So we've taken a similar presentation as to the educational units and calculated our present law adjustments there. The difference between the research agencies and the educational units is that the research agencies do not have that tuition component. So their present law adjustment request is 100% general fund. And I did calculate their increases too. They were about 7% over 2 years and 6%. They're right in that range. And one of the reasons they're a little higher for the agencies is that issue of the county extension agents and how that cooperative funding between the county, the state, and the federal government is budgeted, where the state picks up the benefits for the county agents, but their salaries are not recorded in the current unrestricted fund because their salaries are either in our restricted fund for the federal funds or our designated funds for the portion that the county is contributing for the salary. So that makes it a little unique in the budget build for that. But I think that's all I have. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. Yes.
I do have a question. I just want to be real clear that when I look at these numbers, the bottom line, should the next legislature for the biennium fund a present law adjustment increase, it would be a $42 million figure. Do I got that right as a bottom line?
You do. You would get that by adding the 16 and the 17 number together to get to that 42 million for the educational units.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Further questions? Further questions? Regent Sheehy.
When you're creating this budget, do you, you're not looking at specific line items, you're looking at inflation and trying to figure out what the budget will be based on gross numbers, not based on what people might request at the time of budgeting. Is that right?
Yeah,
You're not looking at specific line items and thinking, oh, we might need more for this, we might need less for that, or we can cut corners here? Is that part of this budget process?
members of the board, we do drill down by campus and look at for example, the personal services. We do look at that pretty closely by line item. I mean, the positions that are included there are only the positions that are currently filled, currently authorized, and currently in the approved operating budget. But we're not looking to increase those positions during this process. We're just looking at taking those positions and costing them out into the future for 16 and 17. So
Based primarily on inflation?
it's primarily on inflation.
Thank you.
Correct.
Regent Sheehy, one of the challenges that we have in creating the budget, keep in mind that we're beginning the budget process before we even have our total base budget done. This fiscal year, which will be completed June 30th, will give us the actual base related to our actual expenditures for the fiscal year. So this process, we really started it back in January, and so we really do move off of the budget figures for the year, because the timing of the process really demands that we do that. And so we do use some fairly large estimates, or not large estimates, but estimates in relation to our line items that we have in the process. We know pretty specifically in terms of the personal services and benefits, the salary and benefits area, and we spend a lot of time on that because that's 75% of our budget. And then when we get into the operating expenses, we look at what are the real major utilities, obviously, information services, and we spend more time on those. When we get down to the other operating expenses, we do more of an across-the-board approach to look at the inflation factor and relate it to the cost of living increases that we are experiencing.
Regent Sheehy, almost by definition, they're present law adjustments. So in the governor's budget process, they're really asking us to what it would cost the next biennium to provide same services. So the time to look at, if we need more, if we need different, I don't think we'd ever be criticized for reducing a line, but in terms of needing more in any particular area, those have to come through a different area. They're not present law adjustments at that point, they're new proposals, which have to be vetted in a much different forum during the legislative session than the present law adjustments do. And that's basically how all state budgeting works, and what the budget office is trying to focus on through the summer is, if all things held the same, what would it cost you to do the same next biennium?
The three of you have exactly answered my question. It's exactly what I wondered.
Robinson.
I just wanted to confirm that I heard that in the present law budget right now, it isn't reflecting, it can't reflect the pay plan at this point. At what point does that become a factor in this?
Yes, members of the board, Regent Robinson, as we move through the legislative process, the operating components for the state funding are housed in House Bill 2. It's always House Bill 2, the base budget bill. And then the pay plan is always in House Bill 13, and that's where the governor's office will propose a pay plan, usually based on negotiation with the unions. And at that time, then our budget becomes adding together what we get in House Bill 2 for our ongoing present law operations, and then adding in House Bill 13, the component that we get for pay plan, which also includes health insurance.
Further questions? Further questions? Are you going to talk about the other budget items as well? Okay.
I think.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, We do have some other budget issues that are in discussion stage with the governor's office, and these are, as the commissioner indicated, items that would be classified in the new proposal area. You'll see at the top of this list there are what were referred to as one-time only appropriations in this particular biennium. And as Frida indicated, any appropriation that has that OTO connected with it has to come back for new consideration in either the governor's budget and the legislative process. So there are a number of OTO appropriations that we have in this biennium that we have had discussions concerning with the governor's office. The first two are really more or less a funding switch that took place to provide general fund dollars for the governor's scholarship and the Quality Educator Loan Forgiveness Program, where in the previous biennium there was a portion of the funding of those two programs that came out of a different funding source. So we're simply asking for that. We'll simply be asking for that to be renewed and dealt with in the same fashion as it was in the present biennium. The Vet Med program was a new program that we received basically startup funding for this particular biennium. And it was, again, one-time only funding with the idea that that would come back to the legislature for consideration in terms of the future of that. And that will be a larger dollar amount that we'll be requesting, because we will have cohort groups in that Vet Med program. It's an agreement with Washington State University Veterinary Program where there will be 10 students per year. The first cohort group will start at the MSU campus next fall. The first cohort group that will show up on the WSU campus will be in the fall of 15. Get my years straight here, fall of 15. And so we will be asking for increased funding related to that particular program. And that was clearly communicated to the legislature in our subcommittee in the last session, because this will be growing over a period as the cohort groups grow to that maximum of 4 cohort groups or 40 students within this program. There's also a very important research project that takes place on this particular campus, bioenergy research, and that again had one-time only funding connected with it. So we'll be asking for the continuation of that, or those discussions are moving forward. There's local government center funding at the MSU campus, again, that we'll be asking for continuation of that funding. There is one other, what I'd classify as really a new proposal that has been presented to the governor in concept form, unifying Montana academic libraries management systems. It's a cooperative proposal coming from UM and MSU, and I think we have someone here that will speak to that and provide a little more detail regarding that particular program. So we would invite those individuals to the podium.
I just want to introduce Dr. Kenning Arsley. He's the Dean of our library at MSU.
Thank you, President Cruzado. Thank you, Commissioner and Regents, for allowing us to speak. This is John Greer, who's Head of Systems and Technology at the University of Montana. This proposal represents an unprecedented level of cooperation among the academic libraries in the state. The 16 libraries that are pictured here have already committed resources to our vision and have pledged collaboration, and that has never happened before. What we're really talking about is disparity of access across the state of Montana. High-quality information resources in the form of databases and journals are costly, but they are crucial to student success and workforce development, as well as to faculty research. Currently, there is no way to search across all academic libraries in the state, but that's a piece that we're already moving on, as I'll show you in a moment. But even when that discovery across the state is in place, the next step will be providing access to the actual resources. If you're a student at the University of Montana or at Montana State University, you have access to approximately 500 databases and maybe 15,000 currently subscribed journals. If you're at the other end of the spectrum, at a small college, you might have access to a dozen databases and maybe 100 journals. But the mastery in the disciplines that you're studying is the same. The requirement is the same. The reason why this is happening is that there's a lack of coordinated collection development across the state. We're operating independently. We're not organized as a consortium right now, and that's one thing we want to fix. The second thing we want to fix is to put the technology into place that facilitates data sharing and collection development. So we have a three-step solution in place. The first is to implement a statewide discovery system, and we are already well on our way. By this summer, we will be able to search across all academic libraries in the state. We're hoping to launch July 1st. The second step in this process is to organize us as a formal consortium of libraries so that we can negotiate with vendors as one voice and purchase journals and databases for all libraries across the state. The third piece of this is putting the technology into place, and this is what we call a unified resource management system. This is a next generation cloud-based technology that will eliminate some hardware at MSU and UM, where it's based currently, streamline workflows, and share data and collection development. And it is these second two pieces that we're asking for your help with. So here's the budget. This is the first piece that we've already addressed with our own resources. All those 16 libraries that you saw at the beginning have already put funding into this. This is the discovery system that will help reveal resources in all the libraries across the state. What we're asking for from you is 1 FTE for a statewide coordinator to help us organize as a consortium, and the technology piece, the Unified Resource Management System. That's a $370,000 annual subscription fee and a one-time implementation service of $900,000. So the total that we're requesting is $1.3 million. Of that, $900,000 is one-time, $452,000 is ongoing. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer questions.
Regent Albrecht.
Chair Tuss, and pardon me, can you...
Kenning Arlich. That's okay, you don't have to
can you
repeat
speak? Can you please speak to the cost savings that this will... I know that, for example, at the University of Montana, there's been they've been taking a really close look on areas that they could cut in certain journals, et cetera, and this seems like an excellent solution and some longer-term cost savings, actually some quick cost savings.
I am hesitant to stand in front of you and tell you that we're going to be saving money, because what we're really doing is providing greater access to everyone, and that comes with a cost. But what I can guarantee is that we are using those dollars much more efficiently and for much greater access to everyone. We will eliminate some hardware, but hardware is a relatively small piece of this. And we will get some money back from the current fees that we pay for our existing library system software, so probably about $140,000 combined between UM and MSU.
Regent Sheehy.
Are there any libraries that have declined participation? Is 16 the total?
I don't think there is another consortium in the state, and that's run by the state library. It's mostly public libraries, but there are a few academics, mostly tribals, I think, that are engaged in that group. So I think 16, we may get to 18, possibly 20. There's nobody that's declined as far as I know yet.
Is the other consortium that you're speaking about, the one from the state library?
Yes.
Has that been successful, and is it a model that you used?
It's certainly been successful in bringing together a lot of libraries and providing them with access to resources, absolutely. We think there are limitations to the technology solution, and this is a next generation that wasn't available to them at the time that they set up their consortium. Do you want to add anything to that?
Follow-up.
No.
Regent Albrecht.
Follow-up to my other question, maybe to be more specific. Are there cost savings with scaling by scale with subscriptions.
Absolutely.
Because I know there's been subscriptions that have been cut
Absolutely.
at certain universities as cost-saving measures, and now you'll be able to bring those back, and with scaling, possibly saving money there?
Yes, we need a buyer's club. We're each trying to negotiate independently right now with vendors, and that's costing us much more money than it should. So we will benefit from discounts of volume buying. Yes.
Regent Regala.
And so just a question on how the portal what it would resemble. So it'd be similar to the public library system currently in the state where, you log on to the Hamilton Public Library's website and you have the access to search and limit your databases specifically so that, in the university's case, if I'm at Mansfield Library at the University of Montana, I can limit my searches just to that campus or to the entire state. Is that your thought?
That's correct. You can start with a very broad discovery and then facet down to specific topics, specific departments, disciplines, but also campuses. Please.
The goal being, though, that all libraries would have access to all of the data. So faceting down to a particular campus wouldn't gain you as much benefit because you would have access no matter where you were. So,
Commissioner.
I think we're good. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks very much.
Regent Robinson.
Excuse me, I do have one question that might relate to both of you or one of you. Sorry. I liked Regent Albrecht's line of questioning about what kind of cost savings there might be. I think that helps us to evaluate this. Do you anticipate any other abilities to see some cost savings, whether it be, I guess this relates to my second question, how is it done right now with any person on one campus that might want a particular periodical or source somewhere else? How does that request happen, and how is the transaction actually done?
Currently, if the institution does not subscribe to a resource, then that is handled through what's called interlibrary loan, and libraries participate and share objects from their collections back and forth with each other. That is not free, though. There is a reimbursement from the state for some of those, and then we might be loaning from across the country. So it just depends where. So there would be a cost savings associated with some of those materials potentially. But again, it's really hard to quantify some of these because of just lack of knowledge in some ways of where exactly where we will be expanding access, and so what materials people ask for, whether or not we own them at a particular time. And there are some other cost savings. Kenning mentioned hardware. With this being a cloud system, we would no longer be having energy costs associated with servers and equipment at the individual campuses. There wouldn't be the cooling costs associated with those hardware replacement cycles. So there's other pieces in there as well that get put aside.
May I just add one thing to that? Interlibrary loan is largely an analog environment. What we're really reaching toward is providing that digital click-through access immediately to someone, so you don't have to put in a request for ILL and wait a day or two for a response. We want immediate click-through to the full-text resource.
President Engstrom.
Mr. Chair, I have a question for our librarians. So we saw in the previous discussion present law adjustment percentage for libraries at 7% or 7 or 8%, something like that, and I think it's been at that level for quite some time. Despite a pretty loud public outcry from the academic community about the escalating costs of journals and so on, and I know from my own experience, Elsevier, for example, prices just keep skyrocketing in an astronomical way, and there has been a fair amount of pressure put on the publishers to keep the costs of journals from escalating quite so quickly, even to the point of things like PubMed and so on that are government funded, I guess. But it seems to have had no effect on the inflationary costs. Are the publishers just completely tone deaf about this issue? Has there been no progress really over the last decade of public outcry really about the cost of library materials?
I think that's a really good question. The publishers will take as much as they can get. But you know, I wouldn't say that there has been no progress. The open access movement is gaining steam. Your university and ours have both developed institutional repositories where we are collecting copies of research that's produced at MSU and UM. As those gain bulk and we make them available through discovery systems, we will be creating a hedge against publisher price increases. I don't think we will ever see them go the other direction, but we will slow that rate of inflation.
President Cruzado.
Yes. First of all, I think that we just need to send a big shout out to all our libraries and say kudos for working together, for setting barriers aside, and this is a wonderful project. I mean, this is about collaboration. This is about providing the latest in technology to every corner in Montana. That is humongous. At the same time, let's also remind us, being disciplined about this. When we talk about Main Street, Montana, when we talk about the importance of research, you cannot have great research without excellent library resources. So it's good to talk about the efficiencies, but I think this is also a first step for us to say what additional investments we need to make in order for us to make sure that our research initiative is as successful as it can be. And this is a step in the right direction.
Thank you, President. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your presentation and answering our questions. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, members of the board, I just also want to add, we originally had some of the research conversation on this list, which potentially will be a new proposal, and I don't want it to get confused. We thought it is of utmost importance, and so we did it in the commissioner's report, but certainly that will be, and much of our conversations with the governor's budget office right now is about potentially and hopefully elevating our research agenda to ultimately a new proposal of significant investment from the state to move that effort forward. And ultimately, we'll need to make a case why it's a good use of state funds and why those investments in our research enterprise can ultimately pay good dividends for the state and for the state's economy. And those discussions are underway, but certainly aren't to a point where the Main Street project just came out a while ago, and we're sort of trying to figure out how those things dovetail together and how we can fill the void that is obviously called out in that document and do it appropriately and make it a valuable investment for Montana. So that's clearly on this list, probably at the top of this list, and so we'll continue to work that as a new proposal as well.
Thank you, Commissioner. Is the board okay with moving this on to tomorrow's action agenda? Is that okay? All right.
Chair Tuss, I had one question.
Yes.
What's the aggregate estimated cost of the 5 bullet point items?
Mr. Chair, Representative Johnstone, Regent Johnstone, let me try to, I think the first two would be a total of $2.5 million over the biennium. The Vet Med program, we're looking at somewhere within the range of 1.6 to 1.7 million. I think the bioenergy research is $250,000 a year, 400,000 for 2 years. In the local government center, the funding for this biennium was 100,000 per year, but we had a larger request in the last legislative session that was actually cut in half. So we have been talking about 200,000 per year for the local government center.
Thank you. Okay. Action item B.
Members of the board, the long-range building priority list, as we move into the legislative arena and working with the governor's office in terms of budget issues, we really have sort of three different areas we're moving forward on. House Bill 2 will be the funding mechanism for the present law issues and these new proposed items that we talked about. House Bill 13 will be pay plan, and then the other area that we have is a long-range building program. Long-range building program can either move forward as a cash program or a bonded program or a combination of the two. The cash program is normally included in House Bill 5, and if there is a bonded program and some other number, House Bill 14 perhaps. The dollar amount that is actually designated to cash programs in terms of the funding resources through the state budget is really a fairly small dollar amount in magnitude. I think for the biennium, the flow of tax revenue that flow into what is called the long-range building account is probably in the range of $11 million for the biennium. So over the last number of legislative sessions, we have seen some enhancement to those dollar amounts, generally through a cash infusion. So this, what I refer to as sort of the third prong of our movement into the budget process with the executive and legislative branches, would be a list of priority items that we would move forward with. And Elizabeth, if you could move to that priority list. This particular list was presented to the board as an information piece in March. It's a culmination of quite a lengthy process, which really started in earnest back in September with specific campus visits. And I participated in most of those visits where we would talk about the specific needs for that particular campus, as well as do a campus tour if time allowed. That particular process allowed the campus to put together a priority list of projects for their campus. Those priority lists then were put together on the MSU side and the UM side. So there was a priority list for MSU campuses, campuses, and that was finalized really probably in early January. In February then, the commissioner and the two presidents and staff members met and put together this particular list, which is a grouping of prioritized deferred maintenance projects, prioritized major construction projects, and then at the bottom we have what is referred to as authority-only projects, where we are simply requesting that the legislature approve the authority at that particular level. The funding sources for those authority-only dollar amounts would really come from outside sources. The major change in this particular list from March was the addition of the $60 million figure for the College of Engineering building on the MSU campus. And certainly we had a long discussion of that very important project and the funding connected with that coming from a private individual to move that project forward. So the reason for including that as an authority-only project to take in front of the legislature would be so that we can have a discussion of the operation and maintenance costs on this academic building as we move into the future. Because operation and maintenance is a component certainly of the state funding matrix that we will be dealing with. So the list of projects, with the exception of the addition of the College of Engineering authority-only project, has really not changed. We did remove one other authority-only project from the list, but the remaining deferred maintenance major project list is as it was presented to you in March. So with that, I would certainly be willing to entertain any questions, and the commissioner and the two presidents can also weigh in on those questions.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. I do have a question, and perhaps this is to President Engstrom. Could you, President Engstrom, talk to the board a little bit about the authority-only project associated with the Bitterroot College facility? We've perhaps had some conversation about that previously, and I just can't recall what that is, and if there's private fundraising associated with that.
Regent Tuss, members of the board, at some point in the very near future, we need to do something about a facility for the Bitterroot College. We're in rented space now, owned by the Ravalli Economic Council, and we are rapidly outgrowing that space. So we have been in conversation with a variety of people about our options in the Bitterroot Valley to either build or lease additional space or other space, I should say, for the Bitterroot College. One potential pathway that has been under discussion is the possibility of constructing something new that would come largely from private money, privately raised money, or at least non-general fund money in the Bitterroot Valley. And if that materializes, we would definitely need O&M money associated with that. That's why this particular item is up there. I will say that we are pursuing multiple avenues, and one fairly recent avenue might involve some space that would not carry that kind of a price tag with it. And so it's fairly preliminary at this point, but we want to have an item on there so that as this develops, which we hope it will over the course of this biennium, that we can have the discussion about O&M for whatever space materializes then. So
Thank
that's
you.
our, at this point, an estimate of the construction cost if we were to build a new facility.
Thank you. Further questions? Further questions? Further questions?
Mr. Chair, could I?
Regent Krause, go ahead.
Thank you. Just a quick question. So general spending authority under authority only, is that just a blank check? What is that? I can't remember.
Regent
Maybe
Krause,
I asked that before.
No,
but,
it's definitely not a blank check.
Yeah.
An example of the use of those particular dollars might be in a situation where, let's say, a campus is able to attract a research faculty member to the campus, and that research faculty member may have a grant that is brought along with them, and they can use those grant dollars perhaps to fit out a lab that would be connected with that activity. So we've got maybe federal grant money or non-state grant money that is moving forward with that faculty member, and it is utilized to enhance a facility on the campus. And so that general authority would give the spending authority for that type of project, that academic project, research project on the particular campus. So it's those small little projects that might come across from time to time, and generally there is federal grant money related to that and allows us to move forward with those in a timely manner.
Just one follow-up, and then the other two, so anything that's under authority only, that's the reason that that's under there is to discuss O&M, or to just authorize spending, because I heard something a little different from President Engstrom. So
Well, Regent Krause, there are two different reasons. One is certainly the O&M. If we're building a complete building, the O&M issue is a major issue.
Right.
The smaller amounts in terms of general spending authority, it's usually not an O&M issue, but it's simply authority to spend the dollars in a facility that is normally considered an academic or research facility on the campus. So it's not an auxiliary facility. It's a state-funded facility. So we do request authority from the legislature to be able to move forward with those small projects.
Okay, well, I don't need to do it here. I'll ask offline for, try to figure it out better offline. So,
Regent Krause, Chair Tuss, the authority only, though, this is a legislative request that'll be forwarded on to the governor's office. That shouldn't be confused with board authority to do that. So we'll need to bring an item of significant value. If it's over the $350,000 benchmark, we'll come back to the board for authority to do the project. But we can't do the project, in particular if it does have O&M, without legislative authority. So they grant, or they have in the past in House Bill 5, some blanket authority, which we can use as a system if the Board of Regents would happen to approve any particular project. But it's two different processes.
Right, and it's blanket authority, but there's no money behind it.
There's no money behind it, and it's blanket authority from a legislative perspective. It's no authority from the board's perspective.
Sure.
You're not granting authority for $6 million worth of projects. It's a legislative request.
Thanks.
Further questions? Further questions? Seeing none. President Engstrom.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, if I could just make one quick point following up on what Deputy Commissioner Robinson said about an item not being on that list. I want to make this point because I know there are people watching wondering about an item we had on the preliminary list that you saw last time, that included an art museum project under authority only. That doesn't appear on this list because it would not be a project that we would request O&M for. And so in discussions between last time and now with Mr. Robinson, we took that off for that very reason. But I just want people to know that it's still a priority for us.
Thank you. Is the board comfortable moving this forward to tomorrow's action agenda? Okay, thank you. Action item C?
Members of the board, I'm going to ask Mike Reed, oh no, Tyler's presenting this one. I'm getting ahead of myself. Performance funding metrics.
Mr. Chair, members of the board, I'd actually love it if Mike Reed would do this. Mr. Chair, members of the board, we have for you here today a request to approve the long-term model, performance funding model metrics. And I guess I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page with just a quick rewind. 1 year ago, almost today, this board approved the short-term model, which was for FY15, this coming academic year. And that model was directly connected to commitments we made during the legislative session to develop a performance funding model that would allocate $7.5 million of state appropriations that came through the College Affordability Plan. And that was done. We had, in the 3 months prior to this meeting last year, worked with a performance funding steering committee and brought to you a short-term model. And at that same meeting, there was collective agreement that during this next year, which would have been this year that just happened, that we would work and continue the work of that performance funding steering committee to develop a longer-term model that would take us into FY16 and 17, the two fiscal years that would follow next legislative session. And that during that year, that steering committee made up of faculty and staff would broaden their inclusiveness, allow more people into the process in the development of the model, make sure every campus had a representative person on there, and work toward developing metrics that were more mission specific. The short-term model only had 2 metrics. Everybody used the same metrics. The longer-term model would be something that obviously would evolve and relate more to individual campus missions, have more faculty and staff involvement. And so that's what we set out, and that's what we've done, and we've collectively now brought to you the recommendations for the performance funding metrics, just the metrics, to move forward into the longer-term model. With that said, we have to work this next 6 months or so on the allocation methodology. So how the metrics work with the money, the math behind it, what percent would the weightings per metric, and really sort of the math details. And that'll come to this board likely sometime early next year, if not in November. With that said, I want to walk you through what these metrics are quickly. And make sure everybody understands those. And in order to do that, Elizabeth, if you could click on, no, you were there, the goals and objectives on that item you just had up. There's a link there to the goals and objectives that guided this metric development process. You've seen this before. We've collectively put this together with the steering committee and the regents to say, this is what we wanted our performance metrics to look like. And so the goal of this whole thing is just a reminder. It's underneath the umbrella of let's educate more Montanans and move the dial from 40 to 60% of the population. The objective is to drive outcomes in the university system. And the outcomes we wanted to drive are spelled out here. Number 1, increase success of underrepresented students. Number 2, increase early college or dual enrollment. Number 3, improve success in the freshman year. 4, increase the number of students that transfer. 5, increase the number of completions. That's right at the heart of what we're doing. And 6, grow graduate education and research. So I just wanted to make sure that we all had that kind of rewound collective memory before we dive into these metrics, and I basically display those for you. Go ahead now, Elizabeth, and jump to those. So this is what we're actually wanting approval for. Is on the front page of this is a summary version of the metrics by what you'll see now as the flagships, again, MSU and U of M, the 4-year regionals, and the 2-year colleges. And so you see the first metric there, undergraduate degrees and certificates awarded. That's simply counting up the number of degrees and certificates that are awarded annually and measuring progress over time. And then you see a check mark box in each one of the 3 institutional types. That's we're going to do that system-wide. Everybody's going to use that same metric. It's the same one we used in the short-term model. Go to the next one, retention rates. That's the measurement of what % of new students come back, in this case, at 2-year campuses in the spring, so semester to semester, and then for the 4-year campuses from fall to fall. It's one of the, right at the heart of our success measures, and it's also one of the metrics we used in the short-term process. We're expanding the cohort, though. In the short term, we used just first-time, full-time, and now we're growing that to first-time, part-time students as well, and new transfer students, so it's more inclusive. And then the third one there hits just on the 2-year colleges, and that's the early college enrollment, or dual enrollment. And we've and the regents have told us this is something that needs to take place primarily at our 2-year campuses, and it's right at the heart of the goals and objectives. So that one makes perfect sense, at least in our recommendation. And then the next one, graduate degrees and certificates. There's a lot of talk, and I didn't do very much explanation about the amount of work and talk that has gone into this. And so I'm just going to take a time out, and I probably should have said that to begin with. We separated into groups, flagship, 4-year, 2-year. We went out with surveys to the entire campus. We did focus groups. We posted things on websites with discussion boards. I see Dr. Makwa sitting here, our faculty representative, and he's one of the big-time flag swingers. At least I wouldn't, okay, Bob, I'm sorry about that statement. He was one of the big-time communicators of this project and really insisted that we ensure that folks on campuses had a chance to have input, that we would respond to people's concerns, and I, not just Bob, but every member of this committee has been thoroughly engaged in this process. And internally to development of these metrics, we had individual groups who met constantly since January and working on these recommendations. So that's where we get back to now explaining the metrics. Graduate degrees and certificates would be counted in the same manner as undergraduate at the flagship campuses only. And then we would also, at the flagship campuses only, include research expenditures. There's a caveat with the research expenditures. We're still in the allocation methodology process, looking at whether we just use straight expenditures or we use some kind of ratio with tenure track faculty, but it's in the vein of research expenditures. And then kind of the nuanced, cool part of this is that for the undergraduate degrees and retention rates, we look to the very first goal and objective, which is increased success of underrepresented students. And inside of those two metrics, we will weight completions and retention for American Indians, Pell recipients, veterans, and non-traditional students. And what that weighting would look like isn't exactly figured out yet, but it would go something like this. You'd count up your completions, and then you get to count them again for that group. So you get extra points or extra emphasis on increasing the numbers and the retention rates within these areas. So it draws specific focus directly to them on really the two metrics that are applied consistently across the system. And we took this approach as one of the national best practices, and the states around the nation are doing this. And we hear time and time again, this is something that we need to account for. And I think this recommendation brings it to you in a very specific manner that you'll be able to see the increases within individual areas, and it'll also, it'll really weight and influence the numbers and focus our attention on those areas. So there's detailed definitions that go with each one of these. There's a comment page where we wanted to collect ongoing basic considerations and thoughts that we want to bring forward to the board. For instance, can we review this every 2 years? And I think everybody would say, absolutely. Let's, and our communications with the Performance Funding Steering Committee is that this work is unfortunately never going to end. We're going to be looking and reviewing the effectiveness of the model, the individual metrics, but we have to lock in for a biennium. We can't change, and change, we need to evolve, but we have to stick and be very consistent with what we're saying, at least for individual bienniums. So that's a flavor of some of the comments on the back page. I would invite any member of the Performance Funding Steering Committee that worked on this, and I'd like to individually call them out. I'm not going to, but this has been an absolute excellent group to work with. We've met almost every Friday at 1 o'clock for a year now. They're not tired of seeing me, but I'm sure they're tired of hearing me. With that said, I'd throw it back to the board for any questions. Dr. Makwa is sitting here to my left, and he may want to make some comments as well.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. First of all, a comment. Just thank you, you and your colleagues, for doing this. This was a big task, and I hope that we have folks watching this, perhaps in the legislature, who kind of put this ball in our court at our invitation as well, to know that we're making significant progress toward this particular model. Appreciate your efforts on that. The question that I had, and maybe I just didn't hear you when you were talking about the dual enrollment piece. I'm just curious why, given all the interest, certainly by this board in the last year or two in dual enrollment, why are we only focusing on what appears to be the 2-year college component of dual enrollment? Can you speak to that?
Mr. Chair, yes, I can. And first off, it's imperative that we keep this simple. And we, that was the problem with performance funding in the past decade. One of the problems is that some states had like 38 different types of measures. The next one is that we wanted to mesh it with mission and focus by institutional type. And so if we back up a couple of years, and this board approved reducing tuition for dual enrollment, cutting it in half, and ensuring that campuses only charge the 2-year rate. So if you even went to a 4-year campus, you're still getting charged the 2-year rate. But what that is doing is saying also at the same time, let's get this offered through our 2-year campuses. We now have a 2-year campus at every place, and 2-year programs at every place that a 4-year campus is offered. So it's the cost related to the public. And so it just seemed as pretty clear that this should be driven through the 2-year, and that they're the ones taking the lead on it.
You don't think that it's a disincentive for the other 4-year schools to become deeper involved in dual enrollment, do you?
Mr. Chair, I don't personally think it is. In fact, we have currently a OTO from the legislature where we are awarding based upon performance to two-year campuses only, but we include their four-year enrollments in there with it, and that's the same way we would go about measuring this. So, for instance, let's take MSU Bozeman and Gallatin College. This is one of the rare times when you wrap the main campus numbers into the two-year. And so if MSU Bozeman has a dual enrollment, that counts in Gallatin College's numbers. So some of the devil behind this in the detail is that we don't lose those enrollments out of there, and they're not, and they're definitely included in growing this. So it's the four-year campuses with the embeddeds that really have that relationship, and I think it's reflected in this.
Thank you. Further questions?
Dr. Moncla, Chair Tuss, Dr. Moncla, could you speak to, one thing we've learned at our conferences, especially with the Lumina Foundation and the AGBBA conferences, that it's absolutely contingent on faculty involvement in the process in order to see success in these areas. And I just would love to know just some of that involvement in order to get that ownership and input that is so critical to moving this forward.
Thank you, Regent Albrecht. That was an important part of, important aspect that many of the members of this committee put a lot of weight in. And in fact, what we see and what Tyler's presented is really a simple snapshot of a pretty complicated process in which we, at many steps in the process, reached out to especially faculty, because just to be very honest and straightforward, there was a lot of skepticism in the faculty ranks just about the concept of performance funding. And so Chair Tuss brought up a good point and an observation that there was a lack of one specific metric in the flagship. To be honest, we started with probably 30 metrics, right? And we did everything we could to differentiate between the three groups in terms of our missions. What are the missions of the flagship versus the four-year and versus the two-year? And so from that long list, we then reached out to faculty on the different campuses using different mechanisms. In fact, as many approaches as we could, through email, through public forums, through charrettes, to try to get input and to let faculty know that the deliberations that were behind the selection of metrics. And there were certain criteria that the metrics, was important that the metrics met. They had to be measurable from outside groups, from OCHI's perspective. There had to be some history behind the metrics and those kinds of things. And so we ended up realizing that over and over we heard that the quality aspect was so important, and we had to make sure that the metrics from the faculty standpoint couldn't be easily gamed and didn't omit this quality aspect. And so one of the things we did at the MSU campus, and I think it's going to gain some traction at the other campuses, is to develop sort of a third list of, if you look at these metrics, there are two that are common across all the campuses. So you could think of that as one category of metrics. A second category would be the mission-specific metrics. A third category, which doesn't show up here because there's no allocation going to be appropriated to it, would be more of a quality control metrics. So those are metrics that may appear in our strategic plans, but may not be so easily measurable from an outside agency. But there are metrics that are very important to the campuses and ones that we'll continue to track to make sure that there are no sacrifices in quality in terms of meeting some of these other metrics, which are quite important in accessibility and affordability, but don't necessarily directly address quality, right? And I think overall, if I had to pinpoint faculty's biggest concern, it's the quality measure, right? And so we've been sensitive to that, and we've tried to be as transparent as possible and throughout the process of going from this large list of metrics to a smaller number of metrics, but I don't know how simple the next step is going to be, because I think when we start looking at developing or designing this allocation model, we'll see that there are many nuances. And an important aspect is including this underrepresented group of students, because many of these metrics we certainly could game by ignoring those groups, but by appropriating some bonus points, or however that is determined, that's, I guess, one aspect of not gaming. My point is that there were many, many steps in the process, and we were very sensitive to getting faculty input. In the end, I won't say that faculty love this, right? But I think I can say that faculty are more educated about the process and understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. So, thank you.
Thank you. For the record, you said the faculty love this? We're recording this.
Well, for the record, I'm not a flag waver of this.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Are there further questions from the board? Regent Regala.
Yeah, I just got to throw out a big thank you to David Shively and Tyler Trevor and Liz Putnam and Robert Makwa. When President Cruzado talks about disciplined mechanics in regards to implementation of the Main Street Montana project, the model to follow is what this group went through. Obviously, shared governance is never perfectly shared governance, but this is a hell of a process in the last year. And the next year is working towards effective allocation models, right? And that's another long, convoluted process, I'm sure, and more energy and power to you. So thank you. Yeah.
Regent Krause.
Sure, thank you, and I've got to echo that. I know it's a waste of time, but I got to echo those thank yous to the people that put in the work every Friday. That was a huge commitment, and Dr. Makwa has been a big part of that process all the way. Sometimes that, you know, we think this is going to be this is like how every bit of the money is going to be allocated, and it isn't, right? And so we have to remember, this time it was $5 million, an incremental $5 million, right? It was $5 million more than we wouldn't have gotten, and we allocated that on a performance funding system. This is actually an incremental, I think, a process, and not the be-all and end-all. And there's still, of course, many other ways that we allocate money, but primarily by FTE, which has its own set of circumstances and problems, as anybody can see, whether tuition's going up or whether enrollment's going up or down. It has its own set of problems. So I want to make sure we're thinking about that. This isn't the way. It's not an all or nothing proposition with this, right? So that's a big thing for me, is that we're only doing this with some of the money to try to do those first things that we talked about there. So thank you for that. And then on the quality issue, it's a tough nut, and it goes across everything we're trying to do, because remember, as we see people doing concurrent enrollment, dual enrollment, as they're going to two-year schools and transferring to four-year schools, all of those things will change the nature of what it means to graduate from a Montana State or a University of Montana. If those students have gotten those, say, first 2 years of credits somewhere else, that changes what those of us that were more start at MSU and finish at MSU or UM think of as an education at one of those universities. So the quality thing goes across a lot of things we're doing, Dr. Makwa and the people you represent, not just this performance funding. And I want you to know, we all think about that a lot, because it is a change, and we realize we're making a big change.
Regent Robinson.
Chairman Tuss, thank you, and Deputy Commissioner Tyler Trevor, who's the two first name gentlemen. Thank you for helping to pull this all together and coordinate it. And obviously, I think it's still good to remember, when I started on the board a few years ago, this was the discussion too. So there's a number of regents, like Regent Buchanan and Regent Christian, when he was a regent, helped to move this forward and to get to this point. So it is very exciting to see it with actual, metrics put in place that have been developed very comprehensively. He talked about some of the next steps and how that's going to play out. My question is, and it may be for the commissioner or yourself, but the time frame that we're looking at, because obviously there's been funds that have been appropriated for this biennium. And so how are we looking at not only developing the allocation methodology? You mentioned a relative time frame, but is what we're discussing today and what we're looking at approving kind of giving the campuses a heads up of where they should be focusing on? Because don't we have to actually allocate the money that we have right now and make sure that we can show that there's been some type of improvement?
Yes, and Mr. Chair, Regent Robinson, great, because I really want to make sure that's clarified. It was the short-term model that you approved a year ago that we used to allocate the funds for FY15 that were from the legislature. So for this biennium, we're free and clear. We've done what we said we were going to do. And so this is in preparation for what might occur next legislative session and then the 2 fiscal years that follow that. So this is really just getting ahead of the game. So this time when we're in the so it's communicating at least a year in advance to the campuses what the areas are. And then when we're in the legislative session, if this comes up, which we're fairly certain it will, we will be able to act immediately following the legislative session without being in emergency mode. And we'll be able to use this model to allocate dollars from that session in the very next fiscal year and the year that follows it.
Further questions? Further questions? Seeing none, are we okay moving this to tomorrow's agenda? Looks like we are. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We are now at our lunch break. In fact, we're a little beyond that. So let's stand in recess until 1:10.
Yeah.
Oh, President Cruzado.
Yes. Mr. Chair, we started the morning session with introductions, and I would like to make 2 additional introductions. Number
please.
1, we have new student leaders at ASMSU, and they are joining us now. And I would like to introduce Destiny French, our new president, and our new vice president, Jordan Garzo. They're right here with us. And finally, we decided to inaugurate a new President's Faculty Leader Fellowship at Montana State University, and we put together a nomination process as a committee that will evaluate wonderful nominations that we received, and I'm delighted to introduce the inaugural Presidential Faculty Leader that will be working with us hand in hand, making sure that we do things right, and his name is Dr. Bob Makwa. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much for that. And Chancellor Limbaugh, do you have an announcement about lunch?
Okay, about lunch. As I said earlier, you all are going to become MSUN students for a day. So when you go up the ramp to the food court, when you first go in, there's grill items. If you go around the drink section, there's Mexican. Go for the 1-pound burrito. And there's also sandwiches. There's soup and salad. Pick out what you want. Like one of our students, we make it all to order. So mill around, find a place to sit. We'll call your name when it's ready. But enjoy our food court and being one of our students for the day. Thanks. And it's at no cost, by the way, so load up.
Be back at 1:10.